Hello, everyone. Blessed Ad Te Levavi. We are cozy today. It is now Advent, so we have the spirit going, and we're gonna start speaking in tongues because the spirit is on us so hard. We're reacting to Christian political theory, a case for Christic Liberalism with Sean Luke on Javier Perdomo's channel. We thought this would be a relevant thing for our channel to do. It's our channel isn't like a political channel. We do theology and philosophy, but this is tied into theology and philosophy because there's political theology and political philosophy, as it turns out. And before we'd start, I would like to advertise, and I've advertised this elsewhere online on like Discord and stuff, that I am in the process of working on a compend of our political theory from our dogmaticians. So people like Hollatz and Hutter and Spangenberg and all sorts of others. So that will be coming out at some point. I have no guarantees on when that will be, but it is in the works currently, and it will be released in print and online in PDF. So you guys can look forward to that. But we're going to watch the video. None of us have watched this video in full. I haven't touched it at all, apart from just like a minute before this, just looking through the timestamps. But we're going to go ahead and present that on the screen. And y'all tell me if the sound is working well on this when I go ahead and start it or not. I believe it will pull in the audio, but tell me if it is. It should, at least.
Government is for the preserving of a common life, that a sort of group of people, of diversified
good volume
people
audience
have
tell us if it's
agreed
good volume
to seek together. Paul commands the church to be at peace with all people. He's clearly talking about unbelievers as well in that passage. And he says, look, if someone wrongs you, leave it to the vengeance of God. So the church then is the icon of Christ prior to the resurrection, wherein Christ is making his, and prior to the return of Christ, wherein Christ is making his appeal through the church to be reconciled to God. That is the form of her existence to the nations.
Just the volume chat. You guys can tell us.
Welcome back to the channel, everybody. My name is Javier Perdomo. This channel's a place where we like to do theology videos, church history videos, and Reformation apologetics videos. However, as you guys know, from time to time, I like to do more one-off videos on topics that are, I think, relevant and important to the body of Christ. That's what we'll be covering today. And so with us, we have our brother Sean Luke. Sean Luke is a bachelor's in Bible and theology from Wheaton College, a master's of divinity, and a master's of systematic theology from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. He's published scholarly articles in several peer-reviewed journals. He's also the host of the Anglican Aesthetics channel, where he explores topics ranging from theology, church history, beauty, and more from an Anglican perspective. And even more importantly than that, he's a recurring guest here on my channel. So how are you doing, brother?
I'm doing well. And as always, my dog might.
We were just talking about this. For people at home that may be new to our channel, just suspect that neither one of us trust our tech setup and our internet connections and all these things. We always have technical difficulties, but it's okay. We persevere. It builds patience, and so that'll be fine. But Sean today, I'll get out of our way in a second. He will be doing a presentation of Christian political theory that he has called Christic Liberalism. And he'll lay out for us what that means. And the reason why we're doing this video is because, as I'm sure anyone who's been on Twitter knows, or anyone that's been in just, especially reformed spaces online, but just across the board, there's been a lot of talk about Christian political theory, about Christian nationalism, whatever that might mean, right? We have a lot of, it seems, competing definitions and claims as to what that system is and what it means. But one thing that we haven't really seen much of by way of podcasts and such is an alternative to these sorts of things, right? And alternative visions and options that Christians who want to be faithful, who would, who care about the church and care about the church's impact on the world, different options they can look to, as opposed to, especially, as I'm sure will come out later, the more, we would argue, sectarian and, racially charged versions of Christian nationalism, as I'm sure will come up later. And so Sean will present that for us here. I'm going to go ahead and pull up your presentation here, brother. Just 1 second.
Cool. Well, thank you for having me on, and I'm really excited about this, and I think this is important. So the problem that's been raised, especially over the past year, the past 4 years, the sort of underlying concern is how should Christian theology inform our politics? In other words, how should Christian theology inform the way we interact with the polis or the state? And we'll define those terms in a little bit more clarity. But here's some of the issues that I think have started to generate tendencies towards what we will call Christian nationalism. Again, I will define that. But for instance, we might have heard in the past 4 years in certain rhetoric in evangelicalism that that we should let in immigrants because God's heart is for the immigrant. Now, that principle is to assume that the government is for the implementation of God's vision of justice. So for instance, if one advocates for policies which provide welfare and care for the poor, like Christian socialism, because God might have a sort of preferential option for the poor, and that idea, that language of a preferential option just means if you have one kid who's struggling more, you might give more attention to them. It's not necessarily that you love that kid more. But if God has a preferential option for the poor, certain Christian socialists would argue that we should structure government accordingly. We should implement policies that reflect a preferential option for the poor. If God's concern is for nonviolence, we should limit guns in a commitment to nonviolence. So this vision and the way things have been argued often assumes that the government is for the enforcement of justice. And because justice is particular, it's for the enforcement of a particular vision of justice. So we want to go to the next slide here. Now, Christian nationalists, they want to claim, and they're going to pull on some of these sources. They want to claim that because the government is for a particular vision of justice, public justice, and because the only kind of justice that exists is the justice of God, that which flows from his nature, therefore the government is for the implementation of the justice of God. And that justice, the justice of God, is defined with respect to God's law, it's revealed with respect to God's law, and therefore the government is for the implementation of God's law. That's the basic structure of the Christian nationalist argument. So you'll notice that at the first, at least for some visions of this, and we'll get into other kinist visions of this and why that pops up, but at the first it's actually not a kinist argument. It's not a argument for sort of white supremacy. It's an argument that the government is for the implementation of God's law because the government is for the implementation of public justice, and the only kind of public justice that exists in reality is that which flows from God's character. So some of the sources they might pull on are Plato's Republic. So Plato very clearly thinks that the government is for the facilitation of public virtue. And as such, he argued that the restriction of certain kinds of music, censorship of poetry and art and things like this, because he thought that the polis, the people, needed to be formed in a particular way towards virtue. Now, Aristotle it's interesting. Aristotle pushes back on Plato in certain ways, and we'll unpack that in a little bit. But for now, we'll sort of trace where the Christian nationalist is pulling from. And Aristotle coins this phrase, or I don't know if he coins it, but he at least uses it and becomes popular in the wake of Aristotle, the common good. And so I've included this selection from the Politics from Book 3, Chapter 13. And it reads as follows. Now, what is just or right is to be interpreted, just or right in the political order, is to be interpreted in the sense of what is equal. And what is right in the sense of being equal is to be considered with reference to the advantage of the state and the common good of the citizens. So Plato, interestingly, was kind of a communist. He thought that we had to have all things in common and in an ideal state. So wives would be had in common and property would be had in common and things like this. Aristotle doesn't think that. He sort of reframes the definition of equality to say we are all equally concerned about the common good. So it's not for him the case that what is equal is that everyone should have equal property or sort of equal dignity or honor or things like this, but rather that what is equal is to be considered with reference to the advantage of the state, namely that we are all citizens of the state, and so the public good is that which tends towards the good of the citizenship.
I think I would add that Plato's Republic is not the entirety of his political theory on the subject, and it's arguable that he's kind of doing thought experiments in the Republic, or at the very least kind of an idealized version of the state, but it's not clear that Plato necessarily had that as his practical and like thing he would actually seek towards implementing it. It's he might have, but if you read his like laws or some of the perhaps spurious works of Plato that are at least in the Platonic school. It's not clear that that is actually what they would practically implement under a Platonic political theory, but it's possible. It kind of depends how you want to read it.
Yeah, I suppose I would actually try to read Aristotle and Plato as being, probably more in continuity than you might guess. So I would agree with you that the point of Plato's Republic is that the well-ordered state is kind of an analogy for like the soul, right? That is to say, the soul that has its virtues aligned towards justice. And for Aristotle, if you notice, he like gives arguments for like private property and other things in the politics, but he does so from the same principle, right? He says that there is this thing as public virtue, there is this thing called the common good, and we're to strive after it. And so, yes, there clearly are differences, but like it is. I will say, I do think it is the case that they probably have the same vision of like the end goal, but they differ on the particulars, right?
Yeah, that's what I would. That's my reading of them too. And if anyone wants more on that, you can read like the whole tetralogy on the political theory. So that would be the Republic, Clitophon, Epinomis, the Meno, the Laws. Actually, it's two tetralogies. His letters are all political letters. It's debated which ones are spurious. The seventh letter is generally considered authentic, and the others are debated. I'm definitely missing a couple of them now. But anyhow, those are some of the main ones. Feel free to read those if you want to read the Platonic works on the subject. And obviously, Aristotle's main work is the Politics.
And a citizen, reading on, a citizen is one who shares in governing and being governed. He differs under different forms of government, but in the best state, he is one who is able and willing to be governed and to govern with a view to the life of virtue. So for Aristotle, the citizen is one that within the context of a state has at least is governable. Wow, my camera fell. Is governable and has the potentiality to govern as well. That is to say that any citizen is a potential leader, a potential arbiter of public justice. And the sort of aim of their government is the life of virtue. If you think about Hadrian and Marcus Aurelius, the philosophy behind persecuting Christians, denominating them as atheists, right, and persecuting for that is that the integrity of the state depends on people having sort of common virtues, and Christians were undermining common virtues. So the assumption there again is that the state is for the enforcement of common virtues. Okay, and let's go to the next slide. Okay, so now let's sort of examine the someone who Stephen Wolfe actually pulls from quite a bit, namely Aquinas. Aquinas sort of takes these streams and he sort of reasons, okay, if the government is for the enforcement of public virtue, the virtue of its citizenship, then human law aims to punish vice. So what people will often point to in Romans 13 is that the government exists for the praise of righteousness and the punishment of evil. And that's often taken in a pretty comprehensive sense, not a wholly comprehensive sense. And again, that's going to become relevant as we sketch our vision, but in a somewhat comprehensive sense, with a view to governing the public good. Now, Aquinas, in the Prima Secunda, question 96, article 2, argues that human law represses some vice, doesn't repress all vice. So Aquinas, interestingly, was a gradualist. He thinks that human law is sort of suppressing vice insofar as the people can bear it. So he thinks that good, wise rulers are attentive to what the citizenship can bear, and they suppress vices insofar as the people can bear the suppression of vice. However, in the next article, question 96, article 3 of the Prima Secunda, he argues that human law does, in fact, facilitate virtue. It orders the community to their good. So if you sort of have the good as a goal for Aquinas, laws, and the good being assimilation, and he's quite explicit about this in the Prima parts, that the good of any creature is assimilation to God, and therefore the good of the community is assimilation to God. And so human law sort of aims at that as a target. Now, in the Secunda, question 11, article 3, Aquinas takes this reasoning that human laws at least suppress some vice, insofar as the people can bear it, and argues quite explicitly for the execution of heretics. And this is where someone like Stephen Wolfe is often going to point to. So heretics, he says, ought to be executed, as heresy is a greater harm than any other vice. So if the government is suppressing any vice at all, it should suppress heresy, because heresy is a greater vice. The reasoning is this, that damaging your soul is a greater harm to the person than damaging their body. And so if the government punishes some bodily harms, they should punish much more spiritual harms. Stephen Wolfe will then take that and argue that actually same sort of reasoning, that if the government punishes any sort of vice, it's for the enforcement of public justice and the punishing of evil. Much more so should it suppress heresy, and therefore, if Christians have a majority. So for Stephen Wolfe, and this is actually kind of what differentiates him from Douglas Wilson, for Wolfe, if Christians have a kind of majority, if there's a Christian prince, they should order the society towards the execution of heretics. Now, Wilson is kind of more of a gradualist. He thinks, and I think his view is problematic as well, but when we can cover that in the Q&A, but Wilson would want to say that, well, basically you need to convert everyone first, and then everyone sort of has a common sense of right and wrong, and then we implement these laws. For Stephen Wolfe, that's not necessarily the case. For him, so long as Christians have a majority, so you convert most of the nation, enough to get a Christian prince with this sort of power, then you can start implementing these sorts of laws for the execution of heretics. Okay, and we can go to the next slide. Okay, now I want to start constructing the vision of Christic liberalism, what I've called Christic liberalism. That's sort of a sketch of what the government.
Before he continues on this, I do think he's focused a lot on the enforcement of justice as the purpose of the state, which is, it's certainly one of the purposes of the state. But I do think there's, before he goes into like explaining his idea, how our dogmaticians frame it, they kind of parse it out in different ways. But the way Hollatz does it, and this is probably the finest number of distinctions, is the purpose of the state is advisory, legislative, judicial, and punitive. So advisory would be providing counsel to the nation under which the state is governing, or over which the state is governing. So like, if the FDA puts out some advisory about some topic, that's a good use of the state, if assuming that they're putting out good advice. And similarly, legislative, writing the laws, judicial, making the judgments upon those laws, and then punitive, actually carrying out the punishments. So you could categorize probably the latter three under justice in some way. Advisory is, it could go in a number of different directions how you want to categorize that, but in terms of how our dogmaticians frame it, that's kind of how they parse down the purpose of the state.
Yeah, I mean, some of the other stuff I'm sure he's going to parse out later, but yeah, like in terms of whether Aquinas is a gradualist or not, I think in some respects he is, and I'm admittedly less well read in Aquinas's political philosophy and theology than I am in other areas of him. But as far as I can tell, his argument for permitting certain vices is not to say that, like, the government just sort of like picks and chooses, like, this vice we're just not going to enforce as such, right? Like, I think Aquinas's point is that the Romans 13 sort of dictum is actually, like, it is very full in what it means, right? It means that the state as such has the prerogative to, punish all vice. But like, I've heard this analogy used at points, like, and I think maybe even Aquinas makes this analogy, that essentially the state kind of, it's very similar to God sort of like ordering the world with privations in it, right? So the world has certain evils in it, and God could theoretically just like punish everyone right away, but he wants to order the world towards virtue. He wants to order the world towards conversion and good works. And that involves like putting up with sinners like ourselves, right? And similarly, the Christian magistrate, yes, he theoretically could, like, which actually there is kind of a disagreement on the brothel question. Like, I believe Gerhard actually just takes the opposite perspective of Aquinas on this point. So that actually is a disagreement.
Yeah, because Aquinas permits it because he feels like the people couldn't bear to have that taken away, because then they would just be too sexually promiscuous.
Yeah, but like, let's just
I believe Augustine takes that same position.
Yeah.
Too.
Yeah, but like, let's just grant that Aquinas is correct on this point. Like, I don't think that amounts to saying that, well, like the state as such just can't, it really can't do anything about that. I would say the difference between the more like libertarian understanding of Romans 13, which I'm sympathetic to on certain days, so I'm not even going to say that this is totally out of bounds, right? This sort of libertarian interpretation is that the domain of the good and evil is clearly in terms of wrongs that are done like physically to the person. So Romans 12 essentially says that, don't take retribution up against each other because like vengeance is the Lord's, right? And Romans 13 pretty much says, well, God kind of reserves for himself, the right to punish through the state. And that's kind of the solution. And so that's the argument that the libertarian provides on Romans 13, whereas I think our tradition and the broader scholastic tradition, their take is different. I mean, it pretty much says that, it just says good and evil. And yes, it makes sense that the state, because it's interested in enforcing good, it's interested in promoting good and punishing evil, that it has like a wide domain to do whatever it wants to in those departments, provided that it does so in a manner that does not because like the fact of the matter is, the Christian magistrate could just theoretically be like, I'm going to put everyone in prison, right? Because they're all sinners. They're all born with like original sin, and they all commit actual sin. Like theoretically that does fall, under the umbrella of a very, naive, and I don't mean that in like a negative sense, but a very naive reading of Romans 13. But the Christian magistrate isn't going to do that because citizens need freedom to actually achieve goods. And so, yeah, to avoid going on any longer, I felt like a lot of that, like I can already kind of grasp the implication that I think he's trying to, create with that. And I just don't know if it actually requires the really, really like stringent sort of views that he's pointing to. Like as you said, Seth, like in our dogmatic tradition, we're, I think, different from the Reformed in that I think that we're I'm going to say this, we're less puritanical overall than they are, except on this brothel question, funnily enough. A take where we're apparently much more puritanical than Aquinas is.
No, yeah, I think you're right about that, Cameron. Just looking at the text, I pulled up my Bible here. But yeah, it just talks about how the one who practices evil should beware, because God can avenge wrath through the state, basically, for anyone who practices evil. And so I think the question that Aquinas is trying to touch on, though, here is to kind of like, well, what's prudent this side of heaven for human authorities to actually enact for a good, ruling, functioning society? Society would collapse if rulers are like, all right, all sinners go to jail. And then like nobody's there to pay for anything, and just nobody can eat anything, and society collapses, and the magistrate would have to throw himself in jail. So you have to kind of, that's why I think Aquinas is kind of a gradualist, is he wants to meet people in society where it's at and form laws around that to try and make it as good and as functional as possible.
Yeah, I mean, like last thing I'll say, and I understand we probably do need to get further in the video, is that maybe there's nuances to like Wilson's position I don't understand, but it really did just sound like Wolff's and Wilson's position just was the same thing, because I understand what Wilson's probably less favorable towards this sort of like, well, actually maybe he's more favorable because he's kind of favorable towards federal vision stuff, which Wolff is not federal vision. So maybe he would be more favorable towards this sort of like external Christianity thing. But I know Wolff actually, he does in his book, because I've read his book, he does have this section where he talks about like, there is at least the possibility of like a minority takeover, by a Christian populace, where it's not actually the majority, right? but it essentially exercises a monopoly over a particular region. And as long as there's not like strong, hardcore sort of opposition to that, right? It actually does have, like Romans 13, prerogatives over that region, even if like the majority haven't exactly like actively assented to it. Like their passive consent would be sufficient for that sort of thing.
I mean, that's kind of what Constantine does.
Yeah.
Like, it's not majority Christian when Christians are a substantial minority, a growing minority, but it's definitely not the majority at the time, and he kind of takes over and implements that.
Yeah.
Government is for on theological grounds. And to do this, we have to talk about the origin and form of the state. And so to anticipate some critiques, some people have critiqued liberalism and the tradition of liberalism that comes out of the Enlightenment as a novum, that it's a complete break with the past. What I'm going to argue is that isn't true. It's not a complete break with the past. And in actually in important ways, it maintains continuity with the past. Now, the origin of the state, according to the Politics, so this is from Aristotle, is as follows. When several villages are united in a single community, perfect and large enough to be nearly or quite self-sufficing, the state comes into existence, originating in the bare needs of life and continuing in existence for the sake of a good life. And therefore, if earlier forms of society are natural, so is the state, for it is the end of them, and completed nature is the end. So, in other words, Aristotle has this famous line in the Politics that man is by nature a political animal. We are social creatures. This is a place where Aristotle and Locke are actually going to conflict with each other. For Locke, the origin of the state can be described as such. Suppose you're in a state of nature. This is a pre-political reality. For Locke, every single person has essentially the right to be their own arbiter. So if someone insults you, you have a right to seek retribution prior to the existence of the state. And the only reason we have the state for Locke is because we surrender some rights to the state, and we allow the state to then sort of take over those rights and administer public justice, namely the securing of freedom, because those rights are better secured in a government. For Aristotle, that's not the case. We're by nature social creatures, and therefore political community, life together, is the natural outflow of us being social creatures. We naturally order ourselves towards community. And the community that binds us together, Aristotle is going to say, is the constitution of that community. Now, by constitution, there are two ways he uses constitution in the Politics. He uses it in one way to talk about genus, and the other way species, or might be, genus and species, I think, namely a general form, and then the particular sort of, and then he talks about constitutional government, what we might think of as a species of what he's talking about. So when I use constitution, Aristotle thinks that basically the way we organize the state, and in that sense, the form of the state, the way it comes into being as the state through its organized institutions constitutes the state, and therefore constitutes the persistence of the state. So for instance, in the Anglo-Saxon conquest of the British Isles, the king, the monarchy, was established in the 9th century, but it really becomes what we know of today in the 11th century under William the Conqueror. So there's the Anglo-Saxon conquest of the British Isles, but then there's the Frankish conquest as well, and you have the meshing together of the languages. And really the modern monarchy descends from William the Conqueror, biologically, and not from the 9th century. But for Aristotle, if we're applying his way of thinking, the fact that the monarchy persisted is what constitutes the continuity of the state. It's not actually biological descent for him that constitutes the unity of the state. We're going to see that in more detail on the next slide. But it's the persistence of form. So Aristotle writes, again, shall we say that while the race of inhabitants, he's talking about what constitutes the persistence of the state. Again, shall we say while the race of inhabitants as well as their place of abode remain the same, the city is also the same, although the citizens are always dying and being born, as we call rivers and fountains the same, although waters is always flowing away and coming again. Or shall we say that the generations of men, like rivers, are the same, but that the state changes? For since the state is a community, and a community is made up of citizens, when the form of government changes and becomes different, then it may be supposed that the state is no longer the same. Just as tragic differs from a comic chorus, although the members of both may be identical. And in this manner, we speak of every union or composition of elements. When the form of their composition alters, for example, harmony of the same sounds is said to be different, accordingly as the Dorian or the Phrygian mode is employed. If this is true, it is evident that the sameness of the state consists chiefly in the sameness of constitution, and may be called or not called by the same name, whether the inhabitants are the same or entirely different. It is quite another question whether a state ought or ought not to fulfill engagements when the form of government changes. So note, and this is where we start to see some of the problems for, I would argue, even Stephen Wolf's theme, and for kinism at large. For Stephen Wolf, if you read The Case for Christian Nationalism, he makes a kind of big deal about groups sort of forming the foundations of government. So for instance, a family is governed by its sort of consistent composition, a consistent ideology. A village coheres by a consistent tradition, a consistent ideology, consistent place, and so forth. So Wolf starts to advocate for certain forms of even kinism. He doesn't quite call himself a kinist, but he sort of advocates for it and is sympathetic to it. I think actually at one point he's called interracial marriage, in most cases, probably sinful. And part of the reason for this is because of his assumption that statehood and a kind of homogeneity or a principle of cohesion are really tightly connected, or rather a principle of cohesion and ethnicity are tightly interconnected. Know what Aristotle just said here. He's floating these potential answers to the continuity of the state. Just so shall we say, while the race of the inhabitants and the place of their abode remain the same, is it also the same? And he rejects all of that. He's saying, no, what constitutes the sameness of government is the sameness of form. Now, Aquinas might reply and point to Book 5 of the Politics, where Aristotle talks about revolutions, and he says one of the causes of revolutions, and this is often what gets quoted, is that a government, a state, has taken in an inordinate amount of people from another race or people who are foreigners. But his problem with that isn't just that they're from another race. It's that he thinks that when you do that, and the sort of foreigners outnumber the majority of the original citizens, well, then they sort of form a coalition and overthrow the original citizens. We're going to think about that, why Aristotle thought that in a second. But note there that he's not saying that if a state incorporates a foreigner as a citizen, that foreigner is not really a citizen. So some kinists, for instance, have actually said to me, have actually said to Javier as well, that we are less American than people who are white. For Aristotle, even if you wanted to say Aristotle thinks it's a bad idea that states open up citizenships to an inordinate amount of foreigners or whatever, you can't say that Aristotle actually would have agreed with that. Rather, for him, a citizen is, as we just showed, one who is able to govern, has the potential to govern, and to be governed. That's it. That's the qualification for being a citizen, which is a constituent part of a state. And the criteria for the continuity of state isn't about the continuity of race, but continuity of form. Okay, so we can go to the next slide.
I do think there could be a distinction made between nation and state here. Insofar as the state is the governing body and the nation is the people. And obviously you can have nation states, and you can have other forms of states that aren't nation states, and sometimes there are multiple nations under one state or multiple states in a single nation. All sorts of different ways you can frame that, but I think that is one distinction that could be made here, in terms of if the constitution of the nation changes, meaning the foreigners become the majority or whatever, that's not necessarily the same as the constitution of the state changing, with the state being controlled by now majority of foreigners or something like that.
Yeah, no, I actually think that's pretty much probably the answer if you hold that perspective, right? Because there's this interesting essay that Murray Rothbard wrote, libertarian thinker. He wrote this essay called Nations by Consent, right? And he's an anarchist. He doesn't even believe that the state exists at all, but he still says that nations are things, right? And a nation is essentially a group of people who, he's not going to introduce a racial element into this, obviously, but he's going to say that it's a group of people with a shared sort of identity, a shared set of cultural norms, and they have a shared sort of destiny in a sense, right? These are separable ideas. So I would agree that a state is, as I'm going to use a libertarian definition here, where it's essentially a regional monopoly on violence, but it's a regional monopoly on violence because it has a specific sort of character to it, right? And that character is going to be determined by its form. And that's different than the people that the state governs, right? That, the people that the state governs would be the nation, on nationalist thinking. So yeah, I think that's a good point. Yeah, like the other thing I would say is that in terms of like some of the other points that he was making in terms of like the Constitution changing things, yeah, I would agree that it's not clear to me that like Aristotle is making the same point that like latter thinkers were making, but like I don't know. Like I'm not even going to wade too far into this debate, given that we're on YouTube. I do find it interesting.
Think of every single thought we have on YouTube for
he's criticizing Aristotle for essentially being like the first real person who wrote like a very unambiguous like political philosophy, right? Like obviously Plato wrote stuff beforehand.
Yeah, and so does Xenophon. But it's not the same. It's not nearly as systematic as what you see in Aristotle.
I don't know if you guys would be interested, but I actually did. Wait, can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, sorry, I didn't know because my mic was weird. I actually asked Sean on his Twitter that exact question about what about somebody who says a nation and a state are like two different definitions, and then he actually responded to me. So
what did he say?
So
I'm interested. Let's see.
All right, so he said this is his response to me about because he quoted this thing from Aristotle.
Yep.
And then I asked him a question. I was like, I think a smarter Christian nationalist might say the problem with this argument is assuming that a nation and state have the same definition. And then he was like, his response is, quote, but of course that ends up being idiosyncratic. Insofar as one wants to talk of a state as distinct from ethnicity, it ends up being idiosyncratic insofar as citizens as those who are ruled, not just those who govern, are parts of a state per Aristotle. If the state is for the nation, then citizenship too, which is a feature of the state, is for the nation, in which case the constitution of the state and membership in the state is for the nation. If one defines nations as anything other than tribes, and a nation has coercive power, it will increasingly become difficult to distinguish it from a state, especially insofar as it extends over borders.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's go on, Seth.
I was gonna say, I mean, I don't think that really muddies the waters between the definition of a state and a nation really at all. Simply because the state and the distinction is really and this is when you read through like our dogmaticians, when they talk about the state, they really don't ever mean, at least from what I've read, and like I said, I've been compiling this content, so I've really read quite a lot of it now, from a number of our different dogmaticians. They don't really define the state as like anything really close to what the nation is. The state really is like the government. That's what the term means for them. When they're talking about, and obviously they're using Latin, but they really mean like the government. So I'm not sure that this really changes, that any of that discussion really muddies the waters about the distinction between a state and a nation. State means government, like, literally like the people in the government. Like I'm not in the government. I'm not even a federal employee or anything, right? I mean, I work for a private company. So, like we're literally talking about like the president and the Senate and the courts and our governors, like that's the state. That's what the state is, in our dogmatician's definition. And when they want to talk about the people, they just say like the people. They say the people, or they say the nation. Actually, that's the exact, like Hollatz, when he talks about this exact question. When he talks about the requirements for a king, he says God's requirements for our king are in Deuteronomy 17:15. And he says, A, he must be a native, not a foreigner. The king should be of the same nation, emphasizing a connection to the people he rules. So that's like, how he kicks off. That's how he kicks off this subject. And you can see there, like, nation is just being used to mean the people of that area, So, you can say Hollatz is right or wrong. I'm not necessarily arguing whether Hollatz is right or wrong here. I'm just saying, I'm talking about terminology, though. How is Hollatz using the terminology? Or the same would go for Gerhard or other figures. When they talk about the state, they just mean the government. When they say the nation, they usually mean the people. This is just an observation of what I've seen when I've read our figures. This seems to also be true in a lot of older texts, like Herodotus talks about this in a similar way. So I can't speak for every classical writer. I haven't read all of them, but that's just my experience with reading those texts.
Yeah. So Tony was like, maybe I didn't hear it that well, but was one of his arguments essentially that, well, if the state is part of a nation, then this just kind of like pushes the problem back a little bit?
Yeah, he was essentially saying that if the nation itself has coercive power, then it kind of like becomes like the line becomes too blurred to distinguish them.
Well, I don't think the nation as such has coercive
Yeah, I'm not
power.
sure how they would have that.
I don't know either. That's just what he said in his response. But
yeah, there is a distinction. Like, obviously, the state, insofar, like, even in our own government, there was that big court case recently.
Well, actually, I just thought what his point might be.
Oh, yeah.
I'm assuming his point might be that a nation might be able to coerce the government to not allow certain people to become a part of the nation or something.
Well, yeah.
There's an argument for that. I mean, that's going to depend on your, like, how top down versus bottom up you think, like, power politics is, right? I mean, like, there's elite theory, right? And then there's more populist theories. I mean, that gets into more of political philosophy, which I guess we could discuss if we wanted to. But that also gets into some dicier territory because you're going to have to discuss some more controversial figures in the political theory world, probably. So I don't know if we want to go there, but...
I'm just theory crafting as to what he may have meant, because I agree that was the most confusing part of his reply to me, was like, the tribes have coercive power, and I was thinking, I'm like, I don't know why they would.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking like, strictly speaking, I was an economics major in college, and we talked about like Pareto, and like you have Pareto's rule, and Pareto is an elite theorist, Italian elite theory school, and when he talks about this subject, he very much, he makes arguments from an economic perspective, at least, and he's not just talking at the state level. He's talking about companies too, because he's an economist. So, he makes good arguments for, it not really being the case that the tribe would have coercive power, but rather that pretty much the elites at the top have pretty much power top down in terms of influence, but then in the government also have coercive power on top of it. So he would argue, like it's not so much that the tribe could have even coercive power. It's just not something that at least organically arises in, maybe there's some super rare exception. But if you have a more populist theory, then maybe that's possible.
Yeah. I mean, maybe
I like Plato, so what can I say?
Yeah. I guess maybe in like a more modern Western government, that might be the case, because we have like rights to defend ourselves against the government, and we can veto and not vote certain people in, I guess. But
I guess certain nations in theory do have revolution clauses, right? Like even the US in organic law has a revolution clause, and some other states in the West do, but it's not that many, actually. It's only a small handful.
Yeah,
I mean, this theory, that's really theoretical. It's like that you have the right to this technically, but could it actually happen is like kind of unknown.
Yeah, I mean, there's this point that Walther makes, because it's funny. I made the point to you, Seth, earlier, that I, think that our view on the right to rebellion is slightly different than the Reform view, which is just that, yes, within reason, it just is correct that, you kind of have to take it on the chin if, like, the Christian magistrate is kind of a bad guy, right? Personally. Yeah. If he's kind of keeping all of his like prerogatives, right, in check, right, you kind of just have to like, maybe when he's like illegally kind of abusing you, it sucks, but like you don't rebel, right? Like that seems to be the Waltherian argument. But he does actually have a caveat. He says if you live in an ordered state, right, that is to say, like the state that existed from Luther's conception of like the Holy Roman Empire, it actually was like a coalition of states, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And he thought that essentially in that arrangement, you could like lean on your lesser magistrate. And, this is part and parcel of Reform thinking too. But, you'll have people like Rutherford, who I really like. I actually think Rutherford says a lot of good stuff on this subject matter. But he makes the point that, and he's no egalitarian in the strictest sense. I mean, I think precedes Locke in some ways, but he certainly is not Lockean overall. But like he does make the point that essentially like there is this like right to rebellion kind of built into constitutionalism. And yes, J. Athanasius, I will grant you, like obviously that exists in America too. Like that is correct.
Oh yeah. Yeah, your state representatives and stuff like that.
I mean, there's debate. There's also the issue of how it's structured. For example, if there's a revolution clause built into your legal system that says, in these cases, you have the legal right to rebel. That's a different situation than there not being that. Like that makes a big difference in your state, right?
Yeah.
Or if your federal constitution, if you're in the U.S. your federal constitution, and it gives specific rights to states that cannot be overthrown by the federal government. That's another different, situation. So some of it does depend on the particular situation you're in, and what you can and can't do.
Right. Yeah. It seems like in Aristotle's context, they wouldn't really have the system that system that America has. But,
I don't know of any situations like that in the past so much. I mean, maybe something in the latter situation, but I don't know of any like revolution clauses before like the 1700s of any government. Maybe it's out there and I just never heard of it.
I don't know of any myself.
The other Paul did talk about, like, he had some comments like, did the nation of Jews cease to exist or change into a completely new form when the Hasmoneans were overthrown by the Romans? His point here is, the state changed, right? There was a complete change in state, but did the nation of the Jews cease to exist? So he's challenging Jean-Luc here.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point.
Yeah, which is kind of the distinction I was making. If the people is separate from the government, not that they're obviously the government is comprised of people, duh. But unless you're being ruled by robots, I guess, or aliens or something, or you let the monkeys rule. But in terms of obviously they're made of people, but we're distinguishing between a group of people and those who are governing them.
Yeah, there's a distinction between the company and the employees.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, there's something to be said there for sure. I feel like I had another point on this, but I can't remember what it was now. Maybe we should just continue. Yeah. Oh, actually, no, I remember it now. It's really quick. Paul said I guess empires didn't exist. This is this point I made earlier. You can have multiple nations in one state. You can have multiple states in one nation. You can have one nation and a state together, which is a nation state. There's no reason you can't have those things. And that's literally what an empire is. An empire is when you have one state over many nations. At least in a nationalist framing, that's how it would be framed. So some people would call America an empire, for example. But I think the Roman Empire is a great example of this, where the Romans had legal control over a large area, and they got that by conquest. Our theologians do defend the right to conquest, by the way, including Hollatz, and Walther defends it too. So it is a thing our theologians have defended, right to conquest. They're not necessarily saying conquest is a good thing. They're just saying that once conquest has happened, those are the rightful rulers. They aren't necessarily saying you can that conquest is good.
Hey, Seth, I would put up these last two messages. A very important person is watching the stream.
Oh yeah, we can put those up in 1 second. What was I saying? Something about coercing? Oh, but anyhow, my point was, I think the Roman Empire is a great example where you have Jews under the control. You have parts of Egypt under control. You have parts of Greece, parts of Italy. I mean, these are not the same groups, right? These are different groups of people, and they are all under control of a single state. So that's an empire. That's an example of not a nation state. All right, Anglican Aesthetics. Jean-Luc says, so to clarify, Aristotle wants to say that the people are citizens of the state. If the nation just denotes those governed by the state, that's fine. But then Christian nationalists are still arguing that the state coerces the nation under righteousness. So the argument here would just be that this isn't how we should want the state to be. I believe so. He's saying that that the state should not be coercing the nation under righteousness. Is that the argument?
Yeah, I think he's going to probably develop this later.
Yeah, he probably is. So we should probably get there. Let's watch till he makes the argument.
Now, Richard Hooker actually seems to agree on what constitutes the origin of the state and actually its form as well. So Richard Hooker in the Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity writes the following. This is in Book 1. But for as much as we are not by ourselves sufficient to furnish ourselves with competent store of things needful for such a life as our nature doth desire, a life fit for the dignity of man, therefore to supply these defects and imperfections which are in us, living single and solely by ourselves, we are naturally induced to seek communion and fellowship with others. This was the cause of men's uniting themselves at the first in political societies, which societies could not be without government, nor government without a distinct kind of law from that which hath already been declared. Two foundations there are which bear up public societies. The one, a natural inclination, whereby all men desire sociable life and fellowship. The other, an order expressly or secretly agreed upon, touching upon the manner of their union and living together. Again, that's constitution, right? The latter is that which we call the law of a common weal, a commonwealth, the very soul of a politic body, the parts whereof are by the law animated, held together, and set on work in such action as the common good requireth. So again, note, Richard Hooker does not define the continuity or the origin of a state with respect to race or ethnicity. For him, the state originates under a common constitution, common laws that sort of regulate and preserve a common life, which secure the conditions under which a life fit for the dignity of man is possible. And for him, he says that the law, which sort of puts that principle of cohesion into writing, is what holds them together. Again, he doesn't say anything about the continuity of race there. So even if you'd want to say, well, maybe Hooker probably would have thought it was a bad idea to accept a bunch of foreigners, he doesn't include that in his definition of a state, and he doesn't say a foreigner is sort of a fake citizen at all. So we can move on to the next slide. So I'm going to take some of...
I think it's again worth mentioning the distinction earlier between nation and state, because if we're just like, if we're going to look at like our, the like Reformed or Lutheran scholastic period, or the Anglican scholastic period, or whatever you want to call it, the Orthodox period or something, and just say the origins of the state, you can't necessarily say it's the same thing as the origin of a nation. Like I said, I mean, at least in my experience, they tend to use the terms differently.
Yeah.
So anyhow.
Yeah, and one thing I'll say briefly is that while I think it's probably true that, you cannot have a nation without having a state governing the nation, like that probably is true within reason. I'm not sure if I would agree with looking at like Anglican Aesthetics definition, that he provided in that message. I don't know if I would say the nation just denotes those governed by the state, right? I would say it denotes that, but I don't know if I would say it denotes that.
I don't think it does. Yeah, it might connote that, but I don't think it denotes it. One possible counterexample, which is often brought up by libertarians, is the polycentric law situation in some territories of America before it was the United States, where you had polycentric law where there was no centralized government. So you would have kind of multiple governing bodies over a single territory who are not necessarily in agreement with one another. So there's not necessarily a true like official state of the land, but there's a group of people there, and you could contend that they are like a mini nation of sorts, like a little cluster, like a tribe or something like that, you could say. And they're a tribe without being governed by a state at all. They kind of have like multi-polarity state thing going on, but there's not really a state. But there is a people there. There's a tribe. So there are cases of it. That's the only one I can think of off the top of my head. It didn't last for that long, but it seems at least hypothetically possible. Which would, if it's hypothetically possible, and I can seem to give one example, that would seem to disprove a denotation, but rather, it would allow for a connotation.
Yeah, like as I said, I still think like the rightness or wrongness of this point probably is going to depend on like, how he fleshes it out, which I haven't seen.
Right.
I did read the first two, the first two posts in your series on that Anglican Aesthetics, which I thought they were very interesting, by the way. So just want to note that, but I have not watched this video.
Yeah, and thanks for the clarification there, Sean.
Yeah,
I don't want to like misrepresent you, but yeah, I guess like if I had to I guess what he's trying to get at with trying to say like citizens are, I think he's trying to say citizens and nation might mean the same thing. I guess, right?
Yeah. I think that's kind of what he's arguing, which I think most nationalists would not agree with. Like when I think of the typical like nationalist
then
definition,
that might be where the disconnect is. Then
yeah, I think so. Like the typical way you see like nationalists talk about this, like people will point to like Herodotus, for example. So Herodotus will say, and this is like in the histories he talks about this. He says that a nation, ethne, right, in Greek, or ethnicity, however you want to translate, but it's often translated as nation. He says nations are defined by sharing specific blood, language, religion, and sacrifices. And sacrifices here would be like customs. So blood, which race, or something just called ethnicity, whatever you want to call that, like a shared lineage of like a super family, if you will, right? And then language, and then religion, and then sacrifices. So traditions or rites or things like that. So that's like how Herodotus would define ethne. So you can look at like that's in Histories 8, section 144. So like that's like one way that in the ancient world they would have thought about this, and that's clearly not the same as the definition of a citizen, right? Like you could be a Roman by that definition, right, but not be a Roman citizen. Similarly, you could be a Roman citizen and not be that, right? Like Paul's a Roman citizen, and he's definitely not of shared blood with the Romans. He doesn't share. He does share the language because he speaks Greek. He definitely does not share their religion or sacrifices, though, right? But he is a Roman citizen, so there seems to be a distinction there, at least in the pre-medieval world, the classical world or ancient world.
So I guess maybe the debate between I think Sean may have been like, is the debate then like the nationalists are trying to argue that the only people who should be citizens are those that are part of a particular nation? Is that maybe what the debate is?
That's probably part of it, at least. Or part of it's probably also that whether the state should be ordered towards a particular nation or not. Or maybe a set of nations if it's an empire, or a segment of a nation if it's multi-states for one nation.
Okay.
Yeah. So Sean Luke's point. So he offered a follow up there, which maybe the last thing before we move on.
Yeah.
But he said, fair enough, and that may be true, but then my case would describe the role and purpose of statecraft. Importantly, citizens don't have to be governors to be considered part of the state. I would disagree with that. I mean, unless you have like direct democracy, where in a sense everyone is their own like lesser magistrate, I don't think that's the case even in the U.S., right? I mean, we're a republic. We have very limited democratic elements, right? And to the extent that we have them, it's pretty much authorizing people through a direct democratic process. But in general, right, I would say that the state is, very separable from the people. And I think that even in the US, for instance, we have this situation, which I think you could also apply it to other situations too, because assuming that the person can be held liable to the law, even if they're a lesser magistrate, that does imply that you can make a distinction between the person as they're considered in the nation, right, and the person considered as they're in the state. So this distinction actually came up recently with Trump v. USA, right, where essentially there's this distinction between like private powers, right, and public powers, where the president has like presumptive immunity, and that actually is very similar. Like Trump can be considered as a private citizen, and insofar as he's a private citizen, he's a part of the nation, right? And insofar, and in a sense, he's part of both, right? Like period. But like his participation in the state is in principle distinguishable from his participation in the nation. That's what I would say.
Yeah, that seems accurate.
Well, I guess like wouldn't a citizen maybe be a member of the state insofar as like they owe certain obligations to the state?
That would make them a subject. not part of the state necessarily. They make him a subject of the state.
And it could, depending on the nature of the state as such, right?
Yeah, if it's a democracy, yeah. But I mean, yes, we are in the U.S. where we do have there are some democratic elements. But if let's say you're not in a state that has democratic elements, then that kind of goes out the window. I mean, like Hollat's just like, and all the older dogmaticians that I've read on this, they make a very clear demarcation between subjects and the state, and those are opposed categories, not opposed as in they're angry at each other, but opposed categories as in they are here's one, here's the other. These are distinct things, and they don't overlap really. He makes sharp demarcations between the two. So he talks about first, what is the duty of the state, and then he goes, a few questions later, well, what are the duties of the subjects? And then he says the subjects are to, obey the state, or he calls it the magistrate.
No, that's actually really interesting. That makes a lot of sense. I think Sean may have missed that then in his analysis, but he might touch on it. But
he says, per Aristotle, citizens are those who can govern and be governed. He sees even potential legislators as citizens, which identifies as part of the state.
Citizens are those who can govern.
Can govern and can be governed.
Maybe they have the potential to govern, as in citizens can gain power to govern.
I mean, I think I think Trump's a citizen still, right? And he's part of the state, but like we made that distinction earlier, like Cam said, or Cam made the distinction, I should say.
Yeah, like I think I get what he's saying. I just think that in principle, those are clearly like separable concepts, right? Like you can have someone who maybe the government has like a certain like caste system with regards to who can rule and who can't, right? I mean, this was actually the case with like aristocracy, right? I mean, that would clearly be a case in which, the power to govern is, in principle, yes, it does potentially exist within a certain group and to the negation of other groups. But you still might be able to say, and maybe this is just a definitional thing. Maybe Aristotle does just have a slightly different definition. But I think this is something that a lot of the Christian nationalists are willing to admit, right? That there are differences in terms of like, Aquinas is very, very, pro-monarchy sort of ordered government take, and, Aristotle's precise working out of that same concept. Like there are differences. Like the question is like whether these have the same sort of I don't know, fundamental like metaphysical underpinning is I guess the best way to put it.
Yeah, I guess it depends on the way the state's set up.
Yeah, it does. All right, continuing.
And then construct Christic liberalism and show my work here. Now, here's what I want to do. And again, people often identify, they have suspicion of liberalism because Locke, I think, and he does make a mistake in sort of viewing political society as not natural. It's the laying down of the natural. But there are a lot of liberals in the politically liberal tradition, that don't follow Locke there. Jacques Maritain would be a good example of this, who doesn't follow Locke at that point. In any case, here's what I'm going to argue are some of the constituent principles of Christic liberalism. So first, in continuity with Aristotle and Richard Hooker, I want to affirm that, and actually also Baron de Montesquieu, Hugo Grotius as well, someone I forgot to mention, but I just read Hugo Grotius actually yesterday, the Prolegomena to on the laws of war and peace. He has the exact same definition as Richard Hooker on what he calls municipal law, which follows from this sort of natural tendency towards sociality. A municipal law is the regulation of a state, for him at least, and those derive, he says, from consent, from the agreement of the people. So I'm going to argue with those thinkers, in agreement with those thinkers, that the government is for the preservation of a common life. And here, I'm going to argue that common life is structured by a constitution and organizing form to the government. And it punishes evils which threaten the possibility of sharing a common life. So here, I think there's actually agreement between many, at least, pre-modern and modern writers. So, for instance, Rousseau in The Social Contract talks about the government famously as derived from the consent of the people. It is a social contract. He's actually he's not doing something new there when he is talking about government. So it's the government is for the preserving of a common life, that a sort of group of people, of diversified people, have agreed to seek together. Okay, if that's what government is for, I think that's how far philosophy can take you. Philosophy can look at history and then say, okay, well, this is why people form government. And this, thus far, again, in agreement with ancient writers and pre-modern writers and modern writers alike. The government, except for Locke, the government comes into being in order to preserve a common life and to secure the conditions for a common life that at least minimally enable dignity. Okay, so theologically then, I think we ask, that's what government is for. Then we can ask what form of common life is best in the saeculum. Now, the saeculum, that term, it's coined by Augustine. It just means sort of the overlap of the ages in the now and the not yet. So in this era where Christ has inaugurated the kingdom, and yet we're waiting the full inauguration of the kingdom, in this overlap of the ages, what is the best form of common life I can have with my neighbor in order to enable, I would say, the mission of the church? And here's why I'm thinking through things like that. What's the best form of
note here before he continues on to the form of government. I'm not sure that there is agreement between pre-modern and modern writers here in terms of the efficient cause of government. It's true that governments can be efficiently caused mediately, as instrumentally caused by people. For example, you vote in someone into the government. But at least our theologians tend to be very, very clear that the efficient cause of government is God. He may work through instruments to accomplish that, like I said, through elections, for example. But the government does not arise in a vacuum. Rather, God establishes government after the fall.
Yeah.
Go on, Tony.
I was going to say, I don't know if he did this or not, but did he creep into the definition of a government is a group of diversified people?
Did he say that?
I think he did.
What does that mean?
I don't know. But I would just say I don't know why that matters.
As in it's not a single person,
just
diversified people, as in just not one person?
I think that might be what he meant.
And you could have. Why can't you just have one person? I mean, you could. Not saying that'd be good or bad, but you could.
Yeah, I think I don't know if he meant diversified as in they have diverse viewpoints and then come to a common agreement, or if he meant that they're diversified in more than one person.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't see why you couldn't have either, though. Why couldn't you have them in just full agreement on everything? At least hypothetically.
Yeah, that's what I was.
It's probably not realistic, but like.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking. I'm like, why is that the definition of a government? It seems like to me, you could have everybody be in agreement and still form a government.
Yeah, or just have a single person, just one person. You could.
Yeah, right? Yeah. I mean, I'd be willing to, sort of. Like depending on how he fleshes that out, fleshes that out, I might agree with him. But like I actually do think one of the interesting parts of this case is like, as you said, Seth, there's this. Okay, he explained.
He says, "Sure, I don't disagree. God establishes government." I guess I'm kind of confused by the section where he covered the social contract and stuff like that. I don't see contract ideas really at all in the stuff I've read from at least Lutheran theologians. Maybe it's there and I've missed it.
I think it's more in the Anglo tradition. I mean,
really
I think it's implied in people like Rutherford and others. And I mean, like basically the idea, and you will find this in a lot of scholastic writers, like Suarez talks about this, where essentially, the government is in God en route, right? That is to say, government is like a divine institution, but it's in man as to form, right? So if citizens are sojourning in a specific area, and I actually would agree, there was this question earlier about like whether I would consider myself especially a liberal. Honestly, I would say I think that a lot of the, specifically a lot of the thinking within the Anglo tradition on this subject is actually good. And that's why I like people like Rutherford and others who I don't see them as complete Lockeans, but I do think that at the very least, this sort of implied social contract thinking is kind of present in previous thinkers, right? So I mentioned Rutherford. I think it's also present in some of these other people, like Hooker obviously mentions it within reason. There is this idea, obviously it's true that like the Magna Carta was not a totally egalitarian document, right? It was not necessarily trying to, like people have made the point that like it was essentially, in a sense, it actually was trying to grant more power to feudal lords, right?
Right.
Ironically enough, that was kind of the point of it. It actually was in some sense like it created this diverse monarchy, to use the term that we were using earlier. But like at the same time, by the law of unintended consequences, it did actually achieve like a social contract sort of goal, because when the people became enfranchised, it actually, as a charter, actually did kind of guarantee that the British tradition of liberalism actually, pushed forward, right? So it was not intended as a liberal document. In the same sense, you can also, like, I'm not, this is a point conservatives make about the Constitution, right? The Constitution clearly does have caveats for slavery in it, right? But you can make the argument that, well, per the law of unintended consequences, that once slaves are enfranchised into the state, right, it does actually become like a deeply freeing document. And I think that's the same sort of point. Like, it's not as though I think there is any specific intent for like a liberal system before, like, the Declaration, which even the Declaration was kind of tempered down by some of the things that occurred later, right? Like, I don't think there is like a ton of that before Locke, before the Declaration, before some of these state constitutions. But there is something approaching it that, when it existed within a certain context where the people were being enfranchised, it was a deeply freeing and deeply Lockean sort of document. So, yeah.
Right. Jean-Luc says that government deriving from consent isn't Hooker and Grotius.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, it's providentially established by God. I think maybe this is the difference between the Anglo tradition and how the German Lutherans thought of the subject, or at least the German Lutherans don't really talk about it. There's nothing really about social contract or driving consent in the German Lutheran tradition that I've seen. So might just be a difference there.
Common life to enable the mission of the church. I'm assuming with Jonathan Edwards, and with actually, I think Aquinas as well, but I'm less certain about that. But certainly with Edwards, and Edwards is following some older writers, that creation is ordered towards the existence of the church. That God has established the structures of the creation to bring about a people in order to unite that people to his son. And so I'm asking then, with the common life, how do we order the common life along the grain of creation, which is ordered towards the church, in the best way that best enables the church to be who she is in the saeculum? Okay, to answer that question, we have to ask, who is she in the saeculum? And the church right now is the icon of the reconciliation of God offered freely to all peoples. So in 2 Corinthians 5:20-21, the Apostle Paul, as a representative of the church, is saying that God makes his appeal to us for reconciliation. We see this in 2 Corinthians 4, that Paul is bearing in his body, along with the other apostles, the marks of Jesus' death, that he might win people to the gospel. In Matthew 5:38-48, Jesus promotes an ethic of neighbor love that's so radical that the church is mandated to take the posture towards the world of turning the other cheek, praying for those who persecute her, and reject not implementing even the law of retaliation, lex talionis. She is supposed to, for now, just simply let that to the vengeance of God. We're actually going to see there are a number of church fathers that take this up as well. But the church is to be that sort of icon in the saeculum. In Romans 12:14-21, Paul commands the church to be at peace with all people. He's clearly talking about unbelievers as well in that passage. And he says, look, if someone wrongs you, leave it to the vengeance of God. So the church then is the icon of Christ prior to the resurrection, wherein Christ is making his, and prior to the return of Christ, wherein Christ is making his appeal through the church to be reconciled to God. That is the form of her existence to the nations. So let's go to the next slide. So how does this transform our interaction with the state? So I would argue we should seek the sort of common life with our neighbors, which makes the church's witness as the icon of the free offer of reconciliation intelligible. So that is, the church is advocating then for things in the state, for a certain arrangement of the state, in which her identity as the sort of ecclesial embodiment of the offer of God's free reconciliation to the world is intelligible. And I would ask then of Christian nationalists and Aquinas and the like, is it intelligible? Is her identity as the offer of God's free reconciliation, is it intelligible if the church is trying to also shape the state to kill those who reject Christ? Is her life and form of existence as a mirror of Jesus on his death on the cross, as he says, Father, forgive them for what they know not what they do? Is her form of existence that she's commanded to take intelligible if she's also saying and trying to get the state and the magistrates to say, Father, forgive them for what they know not what they do, but also state, kill them? Is that intelligible? Is her existence, is what she's called to exist as intelligible, if that's what she's advocating for the magistrate to do?
I don't think we're going to comment on the particulars of policy on the topics of heresy and what the state should or shouldn't enforce by corporal punishments.
Yeah, I'd prefer not to get fired.
We will not discuss that topic in the concrete.
It is, at least, the only thing I'll say on that, it is the case, at least, that Luther does personally not agree with killing heretics.
Luther does not?
Yeah, he got in trouble for it in the papal bull by Pope Leo, because Luther said it's against the will of the Spirit that heretics be burned alive.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So some of our other theologians disagree.
Oh, yeah, maybe. But I'm just saying, like, at least Luther did. That was his personal position.
Yeah. Well, what I will say is,
there seems to be disagreement in our own tradition.
Yeah, maybe there is. Yeah.
What I will say is that there is, in theory, there are other thinkers. I mean, to essentially, and by the way, when I said to get canceled, I'm not even necessarily saying I would have ended up agreeing with it. It's just like, if you say anything that's even like remotely wrong along these topics, right? It's obviously a very weighty sort of thing. So yeah, like with this topic in particular, there are actually, even from people who I would not consider Lockeans, there are people who are offering freedom of conscience, friendly takes before Locke. And in fact, in the tradition of Anglican Aesthetics, in the Anglican tradition, you have Jeremy Taylor writing on the liberty of prophesying in favor of like limited religious toleration within that context. And so I think one could make these arguments that, well, since this is chiefly a matter of the soul, right, that, actually bodily coercion is not the way to do this. But like, I don't see, as far as I can tell, and I have read Wolff's book, I think that was a very incidental part of the case overall, right? Like, you could disagree with him on the particulars, and you could take this Jeremy Taylor, adjacent take. But like, like the problem is that, that is clearly a separable concept overall. Sorry if I got derailed there.
No, you're right about that, Cameron, because like, I was just going to say, like, someone like a Luther, when you look at his politics, he definitely is, I wouldn't say he's probably what Sean Luke's politics are, but Luther disagrees with that, with doing that particular thing, even though he has, I would say he seems to be more nationalist leaning, at least from what I've read from Luther. And so, yeah, it just seems like for him to categorize, if you're a Christian nationalist, you have to have this view, is just weird to me. But also another thing I would say is the way he's phrasing it. It seems like, to take it to its logical conclusion, that if you're a Christian, based off of Sean Luke's argument, you have to be against the death penalty for every sin. Because he was saying, like, part of his argument was like, oh, but because Jesus has this attitude to forgive people, that should suggest that the Christian shouldn't want the state to kill anybody. And, but this is kind of where I'm having some issues with Sean's case. Because, like, I'm sort of, I guess, undecided on exactly where I want to be politically right now, right? But the part where I definitely have hesitancies to Sean's case is where he's trying to make this theological argument, where it's like Christians need to, like, oppose the death penalty for, like, everything. I feel like that would be the logical implication of his argument right here.
Perhaps.
Yeah,
did
I
double
will
check.
say, I thought that too, Tony, when he actually made that point, because some people do make that argument, like against the death penalty, that essentially we should always seek reconciliation, right? The death penalty clearly cannot be a mode of reconciliation, so therefore, the death penalty is inadmissible in a Christian state. Whether that's right or wrong, Aquinas does think that it actually can be a mode of reconciliation, right? Because it actually presses forward death as like this deeply imperative, pressing thing, right? That actually sometimes causes the person to, be like, yeah, I really need to get right with God. I really need to get right with God, right? And that's actually like, yeah, I think it is similar, actually. Like, in theory, like, you're not necessarily going to have quick justice with these people in this state, which I'm not agreeing with. For the record, I just have to say I disavow everything, the person who would be in favor of killing heretics would say, obviously. But like, in theory, I do think his argument proves too much, right? Like that's
what I'm saying. Yeah, because like my personal view is like I'm probably a little bit more lenient on that. Like my personal view would be I probably wouldn't advocate for killing heretics, right? I would not probably I wouldn't, and I would give arguments for that. But at the same time, like I think he, like you said, Cameron, his argument's proving way too much. And to your point, the death penalty can be a means of reconciliation for society as a whole, to the common good, to use Sean's argument, because it can kind of show people what their actions actually can result in. And so like, wow, God is at work in the world. I need to get right with God. And Paul does use the coercive power of the government. He uses the term the sword, which connotates, well, what do you think a sword does? The sword is a placeholder for something that kills people. The state has the sword. That doesn't mean they can only kill people, but it's just sort of a symbol to show the coercive power of the government. Paul in no way takes away the right of a government, the actual inherent licit right of a government to kill evildoers. But there's a separate question of like, okay, is it prudential or wise for the government to do that for everything all the time? And as we discussed earlier, no.
I double checked, by the way, our dogmaticians on the subject of heretics and corporal punishment, and they do disagree. So Hollatz and Brockman seem to be in favor. Quenstead seems to be against. Euler's pupil says that Kalov agrees with Luther. So there's genuine disagreement on this topic, it seems.
Yeah.
I do think there's a distinction to be made, though, between heretics in general and public teaching heretics, and also that because the role of the government is not strictly just punitive, but also includes being advisory, you can definitely make a distinction there, where you could say the government has a role in the church in helping appoint ministers, for example, and therefore should only appoint non-heretical ministers and should defrock those who are heretical, which at least on a societal level would functionally, remove them from publicly spreading heresy, right? So there are different ways to go about this. There seems to be just disagreement between our theologians on how to handle it.
Yeah.
I also stopped a fire, so my room looks all smoky now. One of those candles I had, just like the base, like the base it was sitting on, literally caught on fire. So the fire's gone now.
Christians, I think, should seek the sort of freedom for our neighbor that secures a common life ordered towards political freedom. And with this concept of political freedom, I am pulling from Mill and Locke, but actually I'm also pulling from Aristotle, because Aristotle mentions this kind of freedom as a version of freedom he's actually rejecting. But the fact that he mentions it means that there were people in his time that were advocating for this. So in other words, for Mill and Locke, freedom, political freedom is what I'm going to call it, but they just, of course, define it as freedom. Political freedom is the freedom to act in society without external barriers to that freedom, with the provisio, the qualification that your exercise does not violate the freedom of another. So the state then punishes those wrongs which encroach on the violations of freedom. So for instance, there's a reason why the state punishes stealing $5 from another person, but it doesn't punish adultery, even though arguably adultery is actually morally worse, namely because it's punishing those sets of wrongs that encroach on the freedom of another, namely where I'm using my exercise of freedom to sort of limit or encroach or violate the freedom of another person. Now, why should Christians seek this sort of freedom? To my mind, it seems like Christians should seek this sort of freedom to avoid coercing our neighbors to submit to Christ, because the gospel works in tandem with human freedom to renew that freedom. So suppose the government, right? Christians have a majority. We put a Christian prince in place, and then we persecute anyone, right? We put sanctions on any atheists who speak publicly about their atheists. Now, Wolff is careful at this score. He doesn't say we should kill anyone who refuses to become a Christian. He rejects that. But he does say that if someone is public about their unbelief, they're advocating it in the public square, well, then you start to impose penal sanctions, which ultimately, if the person is recalcitrant, they're persistent, which is ultimately then death. And
I will say, you know, I'm not saying Locke's views on the subject are totally unnuanced or whatever, but Locke does say similar things about public atheism. I just want to point this out.
Yeah. Well, one thing I wanted to tackle what Sean's saying here is like Christians should move for this idea of not making anything illegal which doesn't personally infringe upon other people's rights. I don't know what, like, well, first of all, there's so many laws on the books that we have as illegal that don't infringe on our freedoms, but we think it's like super scandalous to the goodness of our society to function properly. For example, perjury. Perjury is illegal, lying under oath. That doesn't violate my rights, but the reason why it's illegal is because it makes seeking the truth extremely difficult. And also it's wrong, you know, and it ruins, you know, it just ruins good order. And so like Sean is basically trying to say like, yeah, get rid of perjury. Don't enforce against adultery. So, I mean, again, there are some contexts where we already do enforce against adultery, like for presidents. But hey,
like it actually is prosecutable in certain contexts.
Oh,
like,
yeah.
It actually is illegal to cheat on your spouse in the military, from what I recall, and stuff like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. No, for the longest time in America, adultery was illegal. In fact, I would argue like no-fault divorce is one of the worst things that's happened to our country. So
I don't think that's necessarily a controversial take in conservative Christian circles.
no, yeah, I don't think so.
It actually wasn't even legal in all states until like 2010, was it, that New York legalized it? They had kind of ways, they kind of had like, not loopholes, but they kind of had like kind of situations where you could kind of get there, but like it wasn't even fully legal until 2010.
Thanks, Ronald Reagan.
Yeah, so I just like I studied a little bit of law in school, and so I just totally disagree with Sean completely on what he's saying here.
Yeah, for the record, one thing I'll say about this last comment, like even libertarians kind of disagree with this, like whether fraud can necessarily be prosecuted if it's fraud that does not like directly infringe upon like your property rights, right? So like if someone just like lies to you, you know, and you didn't actually necessarily, like that person didn't take money from you and you didn't take money from them, right? It isn't as though your person and property are necessarily being infringed. So that actually, like libertarians kind of disagree on that.
Yeah, as blackmailing is another thing a lot of libertarians like have debate on. Is blackmailing allowed? And there are some libertarians who think no, it shouldn't be, and there's some who think it should. It seems like on Sean's definition, blackmailing should also be allowed because you're not directly infringing someone's rights. But blackmailing is obviously horrible.
It's actually very unclear to me, and maybe I'm really just not as familiar with like, you know, the like Anglican or Reformed Orthodox speaking on the subject, but I really don't see the theological grounding for saying that laws have to be formed specifically around whether or not they violate rights. Is there some particular like way that one gets to that point as opposed to a different viewpoint that, you know, laws are just based on like natural law or the Decalogue and, you know, or just, you know, even like divine command theory or something? Those just seem like all positions that are historic, and I'm not really seeing the trajectory to how you get to we should only have laws against things that violate particular rights.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it definitely wasn't the way in the Old Testament. I mean, I know
Yeah,
Sean's
definitely
gonna.
not in the Old Testament.
Yeah, Sean's gonna get to that, I guess. But yeah,
Probably, yeah.
definitely not the way that it was in the Old Testament.
Yeah, go on.
Go ahead.
Sorry. We're all going.
No, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, I was gonna say, is there precedent? Do you guys know if there's precedent for this idea that that's how laws need to be made prior to Enlightenment thinkers?
So like, Phaser makes this point that essentially like they're like rights talk actually does sort of develop in a lot of these like high scholastic types, right?
Oh, I don't disagree that rights exist in some of those high scholastic.
Yeah, I think that Grotius is one of the people who starts to really conceptualize it in terms of that. And I would not consider him I mean, he's kind of an Enlightenment figure. Like he technically is. He is an Enlightenment figure, but he's kind of an edge case.
He has like a kind of a rationalist bent to him for sure. But I was thinking like in general though, like, yeah, and there's like this high scholastic development of rights. I don't necessarily disagree with that at all. I think it's there as a concept. But I'm saying that all law should be based on whether or not it violates rights. I don't really see that in
like a non-aggression principle, I guess.
Yeah, it's kind of like a non-aggression principle, kind of. It's like similar at least. I don't really see that before the Enlightenment at all, maybe, unless I'm missing it somewhere.
Yeah, I don't know either.
I think that the idea, because when international law, which is this concept that you should have basically these norms that kind of apply across different regions, right? Like that does kind of require something like, a undivided like set of natural rights so that people can essentially like freely go between different areas and stuff. So it probably is there in some of the, like it probably develops, I would say, slightly before Descartes, right? This sort of thinking is being put forward, because before that you have Roman law and then you have regional law, right? And I would say that both of those traditions were probably more favorable towards like our sort of particularist thinking on legality and the enforcement of laws. I do think it probably starts to change, like as you said, probably these pre-Enlightenment figures like Suarez, like a lot of the Jesuits did a lot of work in international law. But yeah, I think Locke and people like him are kind of where a lot of this thinking starts to really shift, where Locke is actually saying things like, there is this almost near absolute like freedom of conscience, provided that the person does not directly do anything to kind of de-sever themselves from the state. He thinks that atheists do that because he thinks that there actually is this like deeply social, nature to belief in God, right? That if someone is kind of completely separated from any understanding of like a covenantal, and by the way, like Rousseau makes the same point, right? Like, like this is actually a lot of the rationalists do, that like essentially you do need at the very least like a bare minimum belief in God in order for the state to exist.
Yeah. On this note, what Hutter says about like the duty of the civil magistrate, he says that it's to pay attention to both tables of the Decalogue, so far as they pertain to outward discipline, to make enactments concerning civil and domestic affairs, harmonizing with divine and natural law, to diligently see to it that the laws that have been published are carried into execution, and to inflict punishment upon the delinquent according to the nature of the offense, to assist the obedient and bestow upon them rewards. So, like when Hutter frames this, he seems to just say like, look, we have the Decalogue and natural law more broadly speaking. So, we have divine and natural revelation, or supernatural and natural revelation, however we're going to call it, special and general. And those are what guide us to how we need to form our laws. And so we need to, look to what they say to do. And that's the morality, and the job of the government is to enforce it. He seems to frame it very much in that direction, not so much a negative way of, trying to not violate rights or something like that.
In execution. I would argue that's a form of coercion. So the reason Wolff doesn't, presumably, like he argues against in his book, mandating that people become Christians or they get executed, is because he thinks submission to Christ needs to be free. It needs to be non-coerced. I would argue that you are coercing anyone if you're putting sanctions on them for exercising their freedom contrary to Christ, because then it's not true freedom. They're only free to exercise it one way, which is towards Christ under that view, and that's a coerced sort of freedom.
I know it's stopping again, but isn't that like a very modern way of thinking about freedom? Whereas freedom often in the past was thought about the freedom to choose the good, and so if you could choose the good, you were free.
Yeah, that's Anselm's definition. Yeah.
Yeah, actually, we were just talking about that. Yeah, that is Anselm's definition of what is. And when like Paul talks about freedom, he talks about being freed from sin. He doesn't talk about now you're free to choose sin or not choose sin. He talks about how you were in bondage to sin and now you're free because you can do good.
Yeah, he calls being free being a slave to righteousness to some extent.
Yeah, actually right there. Yeah, being a slave to righteousness is what it means to be free. So to only be able to choose the good is to be free.
Yeah, God is more free than us, and he can't do any bad.
Yeah, it seems to me that's very in conflict with the point that was just made.
Yeah, like I might agree with what I might personally agree with where he's getting at about the not coercing our neighbors to submit to Christ, not only on prudential grounds, because submitting to Christ is a matter of the heart. So making someone externally submit to Christ won't do anything probably. But
and prudential can totally be like, right, like
exactly.
We're not arguing for any particular policies on this stream. There are all sorts of things that we argue on prudential grounds for sure.
Yeah, exactly. And so, but where he was coming at from the other, he thinks in principle you can't be against any law that isn't a personal rights violation, and I just think that's completely wrong. But
I mean, like a libertarian argument, you could make that argument. I'm not sure that's what is being argued by the Protestant Orthodox, though.
Oh, for sure not. No, I don't think of any Protestant Orthodox, and even in America today, that's just not America's position on a lot of laws. Like I just mentioned one, perjury. So,
yeah.
Right, it makes it politically advantageous to be a Christian and politically disadvantageous to advocate for anything else, and therefore people are feeling political pressure and the threat of sanction to submit themselves to Christ and to submit their speech to Christ, which will and did create a lot of nominal false Christians. So we want to avoid coercing our neighbor to submitting to Christ, to give them the sort of, at least a kind of robust political freedom, so that they have the freedom to then submit to Christ, so that it's not coerced in their choice to pursue obedience to Jesus. I'm also going to say that gradualism, so the sort of that Wilson argues for, is actually not, it's not tenable either. Now, Wilson's is somewhat better than Wolff's in that for Wilson, you only sort of implement these sorts of laws once you've converted everyone. So everyone will want to do this anyway, right, is the theory. I would argue that our common life with those outside the church is always tenuous. It's never guaranteed to remain Christian. Look at what happened to the Christianized parts of the world in the West. We never have a guarantee that those places, those peoples are going to remain Christian. And so we want to still guarantee political freedom so that people generation after generation can freely submit to Christ. Okay, so next slide.
It gets on the idea of, this idea. I think this is kind of the argument, right? He's kind of making the argument of if you put down laws in place that persecute your enemies, then they can use those laws against you, right? That's the argument being made, which is a common law or a common argument that's made by generally people that are in kind of Republican circles in the modern U.S. that don't want to make laws that the Democratic Party will use against you if the election flips, right? You could debate whether or not that type of principle is good or not. But I just want to put that out there that it's not a given that is the case. There's definitely, two sides to that. Someone could also say the alternative position is, the other side's going to make laws that are against us anyhow. So we may as well make laws that hurt them.
And you also
nothing of these is true, but I'm just saying there's two sides to this.
Yeah, I think you also run the risk of potentially if you don't do anything, if you don't achieve anything with political power, right, then you're probably just not, there is going to be a certain point in which people aren't going to vote you in, right? So this sort of argument that I think people are making, where it's just you should always be afraid of using political power because people are always going to potentially, use that same power back on you. Yes, I think as a general dictum, it's fine. I think we should be skeptical of, completely, top down, authoritarian power without any sort of checks and balances. And I think that is a good sort of instinct that the founders had. But I don't think that amounts to being so skeptical of power that you're just afraid to use it even when you have it.
Yeah, and also to your point, Cameron, because I agree with everything you said, but in the discussion that with Sean Luke and stuff, is implementing that's more of a prudential question of where we find ourselves in the world today, right? So I think where we find ourselves in the world today, the founders were very wise to implement that because of how diverse the world is now, and you're basically just going to back yourself into a really small corner, if you don't do that. But yeah, but Sean, I think, is saying almost this is actually this is essential to have in order to have a valid government or something. But I don't think that's right. I think it might be the most prudential option where we find ourselves today. I think there's good arguments for that, but I don't think that it had to be the case, especially back in the day. And there might be some cases where it's not that. It might be better to not do that.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so what are the ends or the telos of state action under Christic liberalism then? So I've argued that the coercive power of the state is ordered towards the securing of political freedom. At least Christians should sort of order the state to use coercive power to guarantee political freedom, because we want to secure for our neighbors the sort of freedom that would enable them to robustly and holistically submit to Jesus Christ. Now, the state does more than coercion, and here is where, if one might think, okay, well, his version of political philosophy right now, of liberalism, it's not really distinctively Christian. I'm going to rebut that in a second, but it doesn't allow for distinctively Christian action in the polis. I would disagree. The non-coercive power of the state is the place for the Christian magistrate to act. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, Aristotle wants to say that the thing that binds a society together are bonds of affection and loyalty, which are ordered towards a life well lived. While the coercive power of the state, then, I've limited to the securing of political freedom, I would say in the non-coercive power of the state, the Christian magistrate can then act towards moving people, moving their neighbor towards further participation in the life of God. And here's what I mean. Salvation is broader than justification. Justification is important, obviously. I'm a Protestant, so justification is really important. For justification by faith alone, having the forgiveness of sins by faith alone, that's all really important. That's only one aspect of salvation. Union with Christ is the more holistic aspect that encompasses salvation. And given this, to move closer to God, to be saved, first of all, is to so participate in the life of God that the ways that we deformedly reflect God into the world are healed. And so to, in greater degrees, reflect God into the world, even if you're not a Christian, makes you less dead if you're not a Christian. That is to say, there are degrees of brokenness in the world. There are degrees of the fracturing of humanity. There are worse people in the world. And you can actually, with your non-Christian neighbor, assist them, show them the goodness of the gospel, and this kind of preparatio, a preparation for the gospel, by accomplishing things which start to heal their person and start to heal the person of the polis. So the question a Christian magistrate then wants to ask is this: how can I move the hearts and minds of the people towards more robust image bearing as a kind of preparatio for the gospel? And that is to say, again, how do I advocate for policies and activities of the state when I'm thinking about the common good for the non-coercive power of the state, which is, I grant, particular, it is assimilation to the life of God. But how can I do this in the non-coercive power of the state, such that people are tasting, even if implicitly, the goodness of God's life shared in Christ? So here might be an example. If a Christian magistrate has a choice between allocating funds for a pride parade or a civic center, right? Like, the choice is theirs. The Christian magistrate should advocate for the civic center. Why? because the Civic Center, or Center for the Arts, is where performances of beauty and goodness and truth can be had. And people attending those performances receive beauty and goodness and truth. And that encounter can actually facilitate healing to a certain degree. It obviously doesn't facilitate, it's not like they're in a state of grace, we're just listening to a concert, of course not. But it's that in listening to a concert, they're gaining sort of spiritual taste buds, spiritual sensitivities to beauty that are ultimately fulfilled in Jesus. So the Christian magistrate does have, I think, a lot of room to act. And in that sense, the vision I've proposed here is Christic. So Christic liberalism, therefore, is Christic because, first, the justification for liberalism is theological rather than philosophical. That is to say, I grant that with the older writers, that the government's end is for the facilitation of a common life and the securing of a common life, which at least has the capacity to be lived unto dignity, lived unto virtue. Now, where I disagree with the Christian nationalists is that they legislate virtue with the coercive power of the state. But nevertheless, I've argued this, that, okay, well, if that's the purpose of the state, then I've argued for liberalism on account of the fact that liberalism is the best way for the Christian, at least the Christian ordering the state towards being a liberal, classically, a kind of liberal state that's ordered towards political freedom, because that actually secures the conditions in which the church can be the church to the world, can be the icon of the offer of God's free redemption to the world. It's also Christic, so it's Christic for both that reason. I've offered a theological justification, and it's Christic because a magistrate should act Christianly with respect to the non-coercive power of the state. It's liberal insofar as the coercive power of the state, its ability to sanction, is oriented towards the preservation of political freedom. So that's sort of the broad sketch of Christic liberalism, the coercive power of the state, securing political freedom, non-coercion, moving the polis towards participation in the life of God.
All right, that's kind of the end of his main presentation, it seems. Let me check the timestamps. Yeah, that's about the end of it. In terms of like the end of the state, I'll just read what Hollat says, because it's kind of brief and it gives a good overview. So here's what Hollat says on the subject. The ultimate and primary purpose of the magistrate is the glory of God. The intermediate and secondary purpose is the public good. And the reason he says this from God is because of Romans 13. And then the proof of the second, he says, the civil magistrate is ordained for the public good, and this is fourfold. First, ecclesiastical. For kings are nurturers of the church and bishops outside the temple. Second, and what he's saying there is Hollatz advocates, and many of our other theologians advocate this too, that the state should be appointing or involved in the call and placement process of pastors. So that's what he has in mind here. And Hollatz also has the idea of removing heretical pastors from office, defrocking them or derostering them, whatever you want to call it. He says, second, civic, as he protects the interests of citizens and drives back external enemies from the borders of the homeland. Third, moral, as it prescribes laws for the conduct of the subjects, so that they may live peaceful lives in piety and honesty. And fourth, natural, as rulers provide for the needs of their subjects, such as provisions and other necessities, like Pharaoh did. So that's what Hollatz gives a good summary there, and that seems to be in line with the other thinkers I've seen.
You mind if I just read some of Romans 13, because I feel like Sean's kind of like missing some of what Paul's saying here.
Sure.
So like towards the so I'll just start from verse 4, Romans 13:4. And this is from the New King James Version. It says, "For he is God's minister to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is God's minister, an avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. Therefore you must be subject, not only because of wrath, but also for conscience' sake. For because of this you also pay taxes, for they are God's ministers, attending continually to this very thing. Render therefore to all their due, taxes to whom taxes are due, customs to whom customs, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor." So like he was basically saying like the state has no right to enforce laws against, at least from a Christian perspective, the state should not enforce any laws against anyone unless they're violating other people's rights. But here Paul says actually we need to submit to the government even when they're trying to oblige us to obey certain customs in the land. So like if there's a certain custom in the land that, hey, you shouldn't buy beer on a Sunday, you're supposed to submit to that. even though that's not a rights violation.
I don't think Sean would disagree. You have to follow that. He'd probably just say it's not that the government maybe shouldn't do that, maybe. But I agree though that it does seem to me that the implication of Romans 13, the way that Paul describes it, is that the government can put out positive legislation to simply, to use Sean's language, coerce people into living moral lives.
Yeah.
I think that's the kind of natural entailment of Romans 13.
Yeah. Yeah, Paul seems to say that it's totally permissible for the government to enact any law against evil. And then there's another question for like Christian magistrates who have like a regenerate mind to figure out what's prudential for their, for their people, right? But I do think that's Paul's argument.
If all of this is just if we take all the arguments simply to be prudential, well, then we're going to be arguing for a very particularized, very, very particularized set of like the idea of an ideal state here. If we take all of Sean's arguments to be about prudential, well, okay, maybe they could be considered most prudential for 2024 United States. But what is that to say about Canada or Mexico or Brazil or China? And what is that to say about any of those countries in 1924 or 1824 in the abstract? If the whole theory is just about prudential arguments for what is the best for the U.S. at this particular time, that is a very narrow, very narrowing of the political theory here to a very particular small context.
Yeah, and also I feel like it kind of destroys his case against like nationalism, because like a nationalist could do the same thing.
That could be the most prudent in a different situation.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Debate about policy.
Yeah. Go on.
Oh, that's all I had.
Yeah, no. Like one thing I was going to add here is that like I do think his notion of like the coercive power of like convincing people to accept certain doctrines or dogmas or what have you. Like one of the interesting things that I'm seeing here is it probably does involve like his more like Anglican, theological, ethos compared to the Lutheran one, right? Because we would be much more skeptical that this is actually the way to like achieve theological unity, right? So we would agree with him that, a person who is like privately, believes certain things that, like, let's say we're all in the LCMS, right? And the LCMS teaches amillennialism, right? And there's someone who's privately a premillennial person, like they, believe in a literal 1,000-year reign. But they're private about it. They're not teaching it. They even admit they struggle with it, but they're not going to like propagate it. Well, like we would say that person, just because they're like, yes, they're not allowed, and there is kind of a threat point there. Like the second that they start to propagate it, it will become an issue, right? But it still is good that person is in the presence of the church, right? That is a good thing. We're not going to excommunicate that person for being a private, aorist or a private heretic necessarily. And what we would say is that, this is kind of analogous to the sort of thing that he's describing, where Christian nationalists, and Seth, you were, I believe, discussing this earlier, where like, yes, that there is a distinction between someone who's like privately heretical and someone who is actively like propagating error such that many of the faithful are being deceived, right? And that distinction does need to be made here, where I think you actually, like, I would agree with many of Sean Luke's points that in general, that there probably does need to be toleration for conscience. And maybe you can say that, well, freedom of conscience kind of involves like the freedom to express conscience. I would just say empirical experience shows that's not true. I mean, I think that within the LCMS, you actually are allowed a lot of freedom of conscience on, individual personal cases, right? Like you are very free to disagree with LCMS doctrine on any number of things that are not like fundamental. but you're not allowed to actively speak against it because we think that, theological truths are kind of ordered to each other, and a break in the chain theoretically could break the entire chain. And that's kind of the point. And so, like, this is I think actually, ironically enough, I think that, his Anglican aesthetic is kind of what ultimately,
is driving. Yeah, I mean,
that
I wouldn't disagree there at all. I think it might just genuinely be Anglican versus Lutheran. There might be just a genuine difference between the two traditions here. And on the note of conscience, on the note of like expression of conscience is entailed by freedom of conscience. I think even if you wanted to argue that, you could really only take it you could really only take it so far that you'd have to say private expression of conscience. If the idea is you have to kind of get it off your chest, something like that. You could tell your friends, maybe, for instance, if you're in the LCMS, you could tell your friends that you have some position that disagrees with the official LCMS position. Like if I'm just talking to, one of the other congregants or something, some other layperson. That is, to my understanding, entirely allowed by the LCMS. But that's very different from posting it online for the whole world to see, trying to get in a pulpit and preaching it literally in the public square, like literally standing up in a box with a megaphone or something like that. Like any of these types of things, right? That is different from literally having a private conversation with a friend. And I think as far as freedom of conscience goes, I think at the most that you could guarantee that of that concept that you need expression would be in the context of just being able to express it in a private conversation if you need to, as we'd say, get it off your chest or something like that. That's all I have to say.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but weren't there a decent amount of people who fled England due to religious persecution by the Anglicans?
Yes.
There were. Right, like I mean, this is a thing, and I mean, Roman Catholic persecution, like that was a very well reported thing. But I will say, in principle, there's a difference between not having religious tests that are just super stringent, right, and saying that someone can't like propagate doctrine. So I would agree. I think, many of our theologians might even agree that, you can't like force someone to say like, I agree with Lutheranism if they don't, right? But theoretically, you could keep that person from saying Lutheranism is a heretical, a religion that, damns souls to hell, right? Like you could theoretically keep that person from saying that. And I think that's really all you need. Like, I actually do agree that freedom of conscience within reason is a Lutheran principle. I mean, it is kind of bent up in private judgment. But there's a difference between private judgment for individuals who express their judgment privately, right? And private judgment for individuals who express their judgment publicly.
Yeah, like people who like spread like false scandals about like people in power that could create public, just unrest. Like someone spreads a lie about the magistrate of their land saying, he cheated on his wife and, he's, giving money to neighboring, Muslim nations. And like a person's like making up all these stories, and that could create a lot of public unrest. Like there might be a place where the state has a right to be like, okay, we might need to shut this guy up because, this is going to create too much public unrest or something like that. Or like people are going to start like killing people in the government because now they think that the magistrate's like privately funding like a Muslim nation or something.
Yeah, but, I mean, like, yeah, go on.
Yeah. Now that we're in America where there's just so much different information out in the air where who knows, it's a lot harder to crack down on that. It might not be as useful, but back in the time where information was so much more controlled, maybe there's some room for that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I do find interesting here, and maybe at this point, Seth, it might be best to like skip around through the other sections of the video. But
yeah, it's getting kind of late over here, at least in Eastern time.
Like Yeah, like one of the things I find interesting here is that even people who I would consider broadly at least proto-Christian nationalists, someone like Dabney, ironically enough, when he writes a very famous book that I shall not mention too much about, he basically says that the issue with Lockeanism is that Lockeanism tries to do politics deductively, whereas politics is an inductive science, right? And I think that you can basically treat Christian nationalism as an inductive science and say that, well, yes, maybe, it actually isn't good to coerce heretics. And I think Wolff's reading of the founding, within reason, is actually like that, right? He basically says that, Madison and others, maybe not even Madison so much, but at least some of the founders, people like, Witherspoon and others, like the point that they were making was that it is not instrumentally useful to coerce heretics. And empirical experience just shows that it doesn't work. You can basically agree with that while saying that the government actually does have an in principle prerogative to do that, right? Like I would agree, it probably is the case that this sort of procedure has been done badly more often than not. But that doesn't mean that, like provided you have checks, right? Which I actually think those checks started to exist even in England, right? Because they had to deal with these large amount of non-conforming groups, right? And they actually were decently tolerant of those groups past a point. And I'm saying, like if you have a diverse country, of course you're going to have to be tolerant. And I actually think that, in general, people learned that it's not a good idea to persecute heresy to the utmost, like long before the Enlightenment was really having its way on politics, right? Like, I just think that was an
I think the 30 Years' War is like huge in moving that understanding, because when you persecute all sides of heretics to the utmost, I mean, you're going to get 30 Years' War type situation if people are in disagreement, and everyone came out of that war just, that was just a horrible. It was the bloodiest conflict in Europe up to that point, and it remained the bloodiest conflict in Europe for a very long time. I believe up until the World Wars, actually.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you're going to have to, those are kind of your options: is have 30 Years' War type situations, or have some degree of tolerance, at least to a point. That doesn't necessarily mean full tolerance or not. You could or you couldn't, depending on how you want to take it. But the other option, if you want to persecute to the utmost, it very well could end up in a 30 Years' War situation easily.
Yeah, and it's kind of like the same thing with like trying to persecute or trying to crack down on like the spread of misinformation or people lying, because it's like if you do that to the utmost, totally, like you're just gonna get so much rebellion probably because it's like then they just think you're trying to crack the government is basically just trying to crack down on views that challenge their power or something, right?
Right, and Luther talks about that too. Like Luther of course, right? It's like his work against the murdering hordes of peasants, right? But then he also writes a second treatise, trying to advocate for moderation by the governors, because after he advocates for that, he kind of gets the governors riled up to really hand it to the peasants. But then this is after the peasants revolt, of course, right? But then he writes a letter to the magistrate saying, "Hey, I want you to have temperament or temperance about this. You can't just go kill them all or something.
Yeah.
You have to rule like lawfully and give a just punishment for what is due, which means not, he's being careful, saying don't go too far. There's a right way to go about this, and it's not just being extreme."
Yeah. No, that's good.
It is getting kind of late. I don't know how much longer. Cameron said he'd be right back. So the next sections are coercion and government fostering public virtue. There's also on hopelessness and defeatism, race, ethnicity, and nationalism, consensus of antiquity, liberalism bad because enlightenment bad, false freedom and true freedom, Christian politicians under Christic Liberalism, should political parties be sponsored by the church, Old Testament government and coercion, why does this matter, and then conclusion. So kind of a lot of sections left.
Yeah.
We could do a second part on this. I probably don't have too much time longer. I don't know if I have time for any of these sections in full.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, I guess if the viewers want us to do a follow-up, leave us a comment.
Yeah, I don't know if all of us will be able to be, we kind of schedule these things and we kind of see who can be on. So it might not always be the same people necessarily. So maybe you'll get some different voices in chat too.
You might get a more handsome and more well thought out person than me next time. But
that's impossible.
But yeah, we'll see. But yeah, just let us know in the comments and we'll definitely try and get around to it. So
yeah, I'll see if Cam comes back. Cam said he'd be right back. He had to step away for a second. I don't know if he wanted to give any concluding thoughts.
Yeah.
You have any concluding thoughts, Tony, for the first part here?
Yeah, I guess like it does seem like, it seems like his view, if it's like in principle that a nation can't do these things, I think it does kind of undermine a little bit of what Paul is saying in Romans 13. And like to use like what you said, Seth, if his argument's more just about prudential, then it doesn't really do anything against like the Christian nationalist position, right? Because the Christian nationalist could agree with all of Sean's prudential points and still be a Christian nationalist. And so I just feel like his project may kind of be undercut by that.
Yeah. Which I do think he makes that point elsewhere in the video, Tony. From what I hear, so I think that point is not lost on him.
Oh, good. Okay.
Yeah, I think there's a point of you can do a kind of idealizing of politics and then a pragmatic take at things. And like I mentioned earlier, Plato does this in his own writing. So I really do think that the Republic is more of an idealized idea on political philosophy, and that's not only true for the Republic. I think some of his other political writings are kind of in that same direction, like Clitophon or Clitopho, Timaeus and Critias also kind of go in that direction. And then I think like the Minos, the Laws, the Epinomis, the Letters are more of the pragmatic direction he wants to take. Apparently I said idealized idea. Yes, the idealized idea.
That's better than so like I was posting one of those like Twitter like AI persona things where it like essentially maps out like your Twitter activity into this like fake AI version of yourself. And I remember I asked the fake AI version of myself, and I posted this on Twitter, like what I thought about scholastic Lutherans, and sort of along those lines with this sort of like tautology. I said, interesting. I've seen some of their stuff, a bit too much focus on technicalities, in my opinion. I'd prefer a much more nuanced approach.
But yeah, anyhow, what I meant was idealism versus pragmatic approach to politics. What do you think the ideal state is versus the pragmatic approach for the current situation? And if you read the laws, man is the law, pragmatic information about the Greek state at the time. Don't read the laws, please. Don't suffer 17 hours of reading the laws. Don't do it. Unless you really want to know what Plato thinks about every single specific law that should be implemented in Greece at his time. It's just painful.
I will say if you read the laws, it will dispel certain myths about the guy and his.
I guess it will do that, but man,
topics.
There are easier ways to do that than reading the laws for 17 hours. Anyhow, Cam, did you have any concluding thoughts? We said we could do a part thoughts. 2 or something, but I kind of have to go. So.
Oh yeah, no, I'm good. Yeah, no, I actually liked it. I think the last slide was like a very interesting sort of case in favor of his position. I'm not like obviously totally on board with it, but since I think that political philosophy is an inductive science, I think you could incorporate like a number of those insights into a theory of government that is broadly Christian in its orientation. Like my thinking, and I think this is me extending an olive branch of sorts to Sean Luke, and I think he would agree with this, is that a Christian nationalist project is always going to be a coalition project, right? You're going to have the more liberal coalitions, and you're going to have the more rigorous, hardcore coalitions. And ironically enough, I'm actually going to quote Biden favorably because Biden made this point, I believe, in the speech that he gave, right after Trump won, where he basically said that like America has always kind of ebbed and flowed between competing visions for the nation, right? Like there just always have been these
from the beginning
times where the rigorists win, and there's times where the liberals win, and they have totally different visions. And you're not going, like, if we recalibrate in terms of like a Christian nationalist sort of view on things, which I'm not even, for the record, it sounds like I'm espousing it. I'm really just, I think it's an interesting idea, and it's an interesting political project that should be considered. But like, you're not, I don't think you're going to end up with the level of just complete authoritarianism that I think he's expecting. I do just think it's probably going to be a lot of people talking to each other and having dialogue, but it probably would limit the freedom of expression for things on the edges, certainly. But I do think that at the very least, a large amount of these Christian groups, especially within the United States context, would have us played a place at the table. And I think that's kind of the point within reason.
Yeah, it's kind of like going back to what Seth said about the idealist pragmatic thing. Like maybe ideally the Christian nationalists would have this utopic view of their state, but then pragmatically when they start to implement things, you're like, oh man, there's a lot of people that I gotta kind of live with in life and work with here, so let me tweak some things, right? So I think a wise Christian's gonna want to try and add some more nuance and try and figure out what the best solution to things are. So
yeah. Any concluding questions that anyone has?
Yeah, we can take some questions from chat for the end. How about that? There were some questions at the very beginning. Pull those up. I do think it's worth stating that a number of the colonies had state churches. I think it was actually the majority of the colonies at one point had state churches. And even after the Articles of Confederation, and then even after the Constitution after that, into the 1800s even, some states in the United States still had state churches. So this idea is not foreign to the United States in a whole, but by the mid-1800s, all of them were gone.
Yeah.
All right. There were some questions. Let me go back to the beginning and grab the earliest ones. I'm not saying, by the way, that necessarily that those states were Christian nationalist states or something like that. Although one could argue they are, could argue they aren't. They did have some laws that some Christian nationalists would argue for. But I'm just saying that some of them did have state churches.
Yeah, at the very least, on the issue of, because this actually was an issue that Jefferson, when he's, the expression like wall of separation between, church and state, comes from Jefferson. And he's writing to these like Baptist ministers who were kind of annoyed that they had to like pay taxes to these like state churches. And he does advocate for like, that being like there being actually a separation for those two concepts, even on a state level. But it is noteworthy that like Jefferson's argument there did not win the day for at least like 50 plus years. Right. And so as such, like basically, even within, the American context, Baptist ministers were being coerced to pay taxes 4 state churches that they did not assent to.
Right. I don't know if you don't have to answer this one, but this was the first question I saw. Would you guys consider yourself traditionalist / anti-liberal? I broadly speaking follow pre-enlightenment and counter-enlightenment figures on philosophy. I'll answer it that way.
Yeah, I would say I have I don't know, I'm still figuring out my views, but I would say I have sympathies to both aisles, and I wouldn't say I'm anti anything out of the Enlightenment movement, but I have sympathies with problems of the Enlightenment movement, but then I also think there's some good things that some of those thinkers brought to the table. So I guess that's my answer.
Yeah, I'm sympathetic to both Enlightenment and pre-Enlightenment figures. I think that the Enlightenment, especially social contract thinking, it's a mixed bag, because I do think Locke has valuable things to say, and I do think large parts of the American project were good. But I think the American project has both liberal and illiberal elements to it. And I think both of those elements are worth considering. I would actually say that someone like Rutherford is probably just as interesting to the American founding as someone like Locke is, because obviously there is this big Presbyterian religious influence that is worth considering, and that's why a figure like Rutherford, who was persona non grata after the Restoration, he is very important to this picture. But yeah, Locke also is important, and pretty much you've always had this give and take in America between the deductive Lockeans, who have a large amount of influence, obviously, and the more inductive, I'm going to say, Rutherfordians, but that isn't really probably the best way to put it. But these people who thought that religion had a very direct say on certain social institutions and any number of things, right? And both of those camps were always kind of talking to each other, right? And I actually think that both of them had something to say. And that's kind of my take. I'm not anti-liberal, and I think that liberal takes on things like property rights and a number of things are actually very interesting and very good. But I also do think that a lot of liberal thinking, at least if you're positing a stronger view of government, it is, I would say, reductionistic in terms of how it views the coercive elements of government.
Yep.
Yeah, in terms of the U.S., I think I don't think the U.S. is the same as France in its revolution. And there are some U.S. thinkers that I do think had good ideas. I have in mind, I think Fisher Ames among the early guys has a lot of good ideas, for example. At least for the U.S. context, in terms of prudential grounds. And actually, I think one of the things that some of the U.S. thinkers do get right is their pragmatism. Not that pragmatists didn't exist elsewhere, but it was a trend in some of the early U.S. schools of thought.
Yeah.
I believe this is the next question. Euler's pupil, what are your guys' thoughts on the continental tradition and their discussion of politics? And should modern Christians engage in their analysis of politics and critique it thoroughly?
For clarification, when
continental philosophy tradition, I imagine.
Is he thinking about people like Nietzsche and stuff? Or is these other people?
It might factor in, but yeah, I don't know how broad he's being.
Yeah, I don't know either.
Might makes right, slave master mentalities, political theories.
Maybe. He does ask about I don't know, that's Samuel who asked about Schopenhauer later. I would imagine he has in mind, Nietzsche could be part of that. Kierkegaard could be part of that.
Mm.
Hegel could be part of that,
Okay, he lists the thinkers.
There you go.
Yeah.
Adorno, Heidegger, Sartre, Foucault, or Sartre.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're interesting. So I've had to read a high amount of Heidegger for one of my previous jobs, which I have to be very secretive about. But like Heidegger, I think has, I don't want to say interesting things to say because I actually had to read. So, to actually, maybe I'm not even going to say that, honestly. Yeah, I'm going to plead the fifth on this, honestly. Yeah, I'm going to plead the fifth. But what I will say about Heidegger is that, like, Heidegger's political thinking, which I'm not going to talk too much about, is interesting, and it should probably at least be studied.
I don't have a ton of thoughts on the question.
Me neither.
Other than, I mean, I wouldn't personally build off of it as the base for something bigger.
I think if it becomes if like this continental form of politics, I guess, starts getting rise and influence, then maybe it's important for Christians to look deeper into it and address it if they think there's some problems with it, I guess.
Yeah, just don't ask what Heidegger was doing between 1933 and 1945.
I think was this next question.
Hegel and
Hegel was,
Hamann, liberal or anti-liberal.
Hegel's so interesting. So there are ways in which Hegel is kind of like, this. He has some anti-enlightenment type of ideas, certainly. I guess if other people was asking politically, I'm not sure. Some of his ideas can certainly be used by illiberal thinkers. His ideas on nations and peoples. I'm not really a fan of Hegel personally, but so you could take his ideas in that direction. Actually, Cooper's pointed that out too. Not that I looked at Cooper as a source of political philosophy necessarily, but he's pointed it out, and I think I think some of his comments are accurate. Hamann I do take to be, kind of this counter Enlightenment figure. He's definitely counter rationalists, just very clearly. I mean, he openly speaks against rationalists in his era, right? So he's clearly counter rationalist at the very least, and he doesn't really seem to have a leaning towards empiricism at all. So he's kind of definitely opposing the two major schools of Enlightenment thought in his time. So and he has favorable views towards the Lutheran Orthodox. So I think in that way, he has, I consider him to be, kind of a counter Enlightenment figure. I think that's the same, Isaiah Berlin, of course, calls Hamann a counter Enlightenment thinker. Berlin's thought can be critiqued. A lot of modern, there's been a lot of critique of Berlin since Berlin, in that he was very reductionist. Like he calls de Maistre a fascist, or a proto-fascist, I think, which is probably not accurate. Fascists might have drawn on some of de Maistre's ideas, but he's just, I don't think you can really characterize him that way. But I like Hamann. As far as like Hamann's London writings, that's like the, what people go to in terms of his theology. The London writings are awesome. There's also the Socratic Memorabilia is the other major writing. I haven't read as much of that.
Sure.
Maybe also comments on Hegel and Hamann.
Nope.
Okay. Opinions on Schopenhauer's politics. I'm broadly familiar with Schopenhauer's politics, just from like secondary stuff, like people talking about it on podcasts and YouTube videos and streams and stuff. So I can't speak to details. From what I vague, the general ideas I have from listening to people talk about his politics, there are probably some useful things in there, and then some things that are really, really wacky. He has influence on figures I won't name, who tend to be very much into the idea of religions being kind of all having some sort of shared truth, if you know the political school I'm talking about.
Wonder what you're talking about.
Which that school of thought probably has the occasional idea that is useful, and then probably a lot of nonsense thrown into. If there's a particular very hard to read thinker that wrote intentionally obscurely, who is debated whether or not he wrote complete drivel and nonsense, or whether he actually had good ideas and he's just couching it all in obscure language. But he shall not be named.
I like this next question. I don't know. He didn't.
Why did Hamilton get things so right? I kind of like some of Hamilton's ideas. I think in terms of prudential policy in the colonies, or not colonies, sorry, the early United States, I kind of like federalism in the theoretical sense, but I also think I'm also a pretty firm believer in states' rights in terms of like prudential U.S. policy. So
yeah,
I'm very conflicted about the early 1800s leading up to the war and all that. I kind of like the Federalist ideas, but I think there's also like an amount of like who's in the right and who's in the wrong in terms of states' rights that makes it tricky.
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of my take. So I think that Hamilton's like disposition was more conservative than Jefferson's was, and
I'd agree.
Plenty of people make this point, like Russell Kirk makes this point, I believe, right? So
yeah, he does.
Like essentially Jefferson was pretty radical. I mean, he is certainly radically. I mean, he's not totally egalitarian, but he is broadly egalitarian, and he has this more like deductivist a priori approach to politics, right? But yes, I think most of his like predictions have played out like in his favor, right? That I do think that the Federalist project has not been as successful as it could be, and I do think that the anti-federalist critique within reason, like yes, there were issues with the Articles of Confederacy, but they were kind of like self-correcting even at the time. Like a lot of the economic issues and any number of things, like they were just engaged in a costly war, right? So it makes sense that some of those issues were going to take a long time to solve. But there actually was a economic like boom like shortly before the Constitution was ratified. So yeah, I honestly like I agree that Jeffersonian like agrarianism is like it has issues, like 100% it does, and I mean it's the same sort of critique that you can leverage like of a lot of things, right? Where it definitely was probably not the best ideology if you want to push forward like a superpower. Like you probably do want something more like what Hamilton's pointing at. But if you want like your people to thrive and succeed in the best way possible, then I think Jefferson actually was more correct than Hamilton was.
What are your guys' thoughts on Friedrich Julius Stahl, the political philosopher? I heard that Dr. Jordan Cooper was a fan of his. What was his theory of politics like? My knowledge of Stahl is pretty much what Cooper has talked about and reading his Wikipedia article. So not very in-depth, a basic overview. It seems to me that from what I grasp, Stahl seems to be something of like, mixed government polity, and wants kind of like this slow reform of the state. It seemed, and from how Cooper has characterized him, he seems similar to Burke in kind of like this, like Burke is kind of a liberal, but then he's like also kind of not. Or as Kirk would say, Burke's a liberal, or Burke's a conservative because he's a liberal. And it seems to me,
it's actually the opposite.
Or always opposite. He's a liberal because he's a conservative.
He's a liberal because he's a conservative. He thinks that like the nature of constitutions kind of imply like some degree of liberal rights.
Right. Yeah. So like my understanding of Stahl is that he's kind of a similar type of figure, but I don't have like a super in-depth knowledge of Stahl to say more than that. And I actually like a lot of what Burke says. I've called myself a Burkean before, and but there's different ways to go about that. You can like Burke because he's a Whig, and you can like Burke because he's friends with de Maistre. So there are different ways to look at Burke, and which parts you like from him. So you can take that in different directions. All right, Euler's Pupil is one more. Last question, Euler's Pupil says, so would you guys agree that one should do metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics first before politics, or should one proceed inductively on politics as you discussed earlier?
I mean, so I guess like if you're trying to do these sort of like a priori like inductive reasonings, not necessarily fully a priori, it's going to involve some kind of personal experience in the world. But yeah, like when you're doing your a priori exercises of like metaphysics and epistemology and ethics, yeah, that should probably come first before you trying to consider your politics, because your politics are going to be based upon your ethics, of course. Like, you can't have a good political theory if you don't have your ethics worked out. So your political theory should be kind of built upon those things and your experience in the world and what you think is going to actually work. And also you want to kind of meet people where they're at, and you want to respect natural law. So that goes back to ethics, though, of course. So I guess that's what I would say.
Yeah. So I want to clarify, when I said that, political science is, and I probably said political philosophy, but I meant political science is like a inductive science. I mean to say that you have to study the various ways in which different, political projects have accommodated themselves to the common good, right? So you have to do that. But I do agree that you have to do ethics and metaphysics before that. So like effectively you have to look at anthropology, and you have to look at ethics, and you have to be like, what is man, right? Man is a social animal. Man tends to find himself in societies. And as such, since societies presuppose political order or social order, there is politics built into the very nature of what society is. And this is the standard argument for government that you find in various thinkers. And I would say the inductive part of that is what contributes to the social or common good, right? And I would say that the inductive part is that you kind of have to look at the way that different political arrangements have contributed to the common good. And I do agree that the common or social or public good is kind of a hard thing to define, and that's something that people have critiqued in the past. But I mean, like the standard definition is that it's a good that's held in common with the community. I mean, that's relatively easy in that sense. That is to say, it's not an individual good, and it's not a good that's held within the context of a domestic household, but it's essentially, the cumulative, collection of social interactions and how that contributes. And Adams makes this point, to the public happiness. And happiness here would not be defined in terms of this like utilitarian happiness, but it would be defined in terms of, collective happiness in the way that, say, Aristotle would define it, this eudaimonia sort of thing, where you are actually achieving the contemplative life in the best possible way. And the question is like, would something like, I don't know, public heresy that keeps you from maybe achieving the contemplative life in the best possible way, inductively speaking, is that something that we would imagine would contribute to the contemplative life? I mean, I kind of just answered my own question the way I worded it, but it wouldn't necessarily. But it also might be the case that just punishing and killing people willy-nilly because of religious views is not. Similarly, it would also be bad in that department. So So both of these things have to be considered. So when I say that like political science is inductive, I would say political philosophy, like the base, prolegomena part of political philosophy, is clearly part of anthropology or part of metaphysics or ethics. But I would say, the precise like mode of government that suits a people is something that has to be determined inductively and not deductively.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah, I pretty much agree with everything you said there. I don't think I have really anything to add.
Yeah.
Alrighty, no more questions in chat, so I think that's all we've got here. Well, thank you everyone for watching. We might do a part 2 if it sounds like people are interested. That maybe with the different people, maybe with the same people. Don't know what time that would be. We can't really guarantee anything because we haven't discussed more than what you've seen on live stream here. So if there is one, we'll you'll see it, I guess. And if there isn't, you won't. So thanks everyone, and have a good night.